All right, gather round, folks, because tonight we're not starting with some stuffy philosopher, a regal ruler, or an overlooked princess. Nope, we're diving headfirst into a gritty, bone-rattling path that sprawls over 2 0 miles of harsh, relentless wilds. This trail wasn't carved by royalty, was clawed out by blood, sweat, and wagon wheels that cracked like old bones under the sun's cruel gaze. So, before you settle into your cozy seat, take a second to show some love if you're truly digging these tales. Tap that like and subscribe. And don't be shy, tell me where you're tuning in from and what hour the clock's striking in your corner of the globe. It's always a thrill to see who's braving this story from across the map. Now, lean in close, flick on that fan to set the mood with a low hum, and let's meander into tonight's trek together. So, you're off to the untamed Westbold move, friend. You've waved a final farewell to your snug little home, your friendly neighbors, and yes, those indoor plumbing perks you'll soon be dreaming about. You're heading to the wild lands of Cascade Valley, lured by fables of fertile ground and fresh beginnings, though the fine print also mentions drowning at river fords and a healthy side of dysentery. But before you chase that promised future, you gotta pack. And trust me, packing this rickety rolling coffin is no holiday picnic. Forget, did I pack my toothbrush? This is, will forgetting a single axle pin turn my whole clan into ghost stories on these plains. Your wagon, no fancier than a modern-day minivan, is a wooden rattletrap with no fancy shocks or brakes. It's held together by stubborn faith and more hope than sense, draped with a canvas tarp that leaks exactly when you least want it to. Inside this creaking death trap, you've got to stuff 6 months' worth of everything. Barrels of dried beans, jugs of questionable water, blankets that smell faintly of regret, bandages, and rusty tools. Plus, there's the pork barrel, a cracked barrel of lard, your 4 squabbling kids, and your partner's prized accordion spoiler. That accordion won't make it past the first ridge. Arguments are already brewing. Do we really need that second barrel of pickled onions? Absolutely. The cradle for the baby? Probably not. And those books you swore you'd read under the starlight? Dream on, friend. On this path, if you can't chew it or patch a wheel with it, it's gone the second the wagon tips. Meanwhile, your ox sent those burly, half-trained beasts who see right through your big dreamsare, giving you side-eye that says, "You fool." They're damp, stinking of hay, and silent judgment. And they've already crushed your toes twice. Your little ones are whining. Your partner is cursing your upside-down packing job. And your neighbors? They're pretending to wave you off with smiles, but you can see in their eyes that they're already planning which of your goods they'll scavenge when you crawl back home in defeat, or don't crawl back at all. And of course, that's the moment the first wheel snaps. You've barely left your front yard, it's day 0, and you're already bleeding from a splinter, dripping with sweat, and muttering curses about destiny's grand illusions. If you're already ready to give up before you've even left Maple Creek, just wait until you meet your first hailstorm on the plains. You probably pictured yourself riding in the wagon like a prairie prince, bouncing along to Oregon's call while the oxen trudged ahead in docile glory. Well, buckle up for a rude awakening, friend. About an hour past the town border, you realize this wagon seat isn't a throne. It's a cramped, coffin-like cage where each bump sends your spine into a brief religious crisis. Inside, it's a cacophony of pots clanking, barrels rocking, and the ripe stench of unwashed feet mixed with smoked pork. The kids? They're brawling over a half-mashed turnip again. So you climb out and walk. Everyone does. The wagon's already stuffed to bursting, and every extra pound riding inside just begs the wheels to snap like twigs. The trail stretches ahead in a cruel, never-ending ribbon dusty, cracked and eager to claim your sweat. Each step churns up a cloud of powder that seeps into your boots, your hair, your very soul. You can taste that grit in your breakfast, more earth than oat. The fancy boots you had made in Rivertown? By mile 5, they're cutting your feet raw, blisters blooming like little curses. But what are you going to do? Go home? Oregon's out there calling you, so you press on. You shuffle beside your wagon, weaving past drovers with haunted eyes and swishing oxtails. You hop over steaming cow piles like some twisted dance, pausing only to wrestle the wagon free of ruts or gulp down a mouthful of warm, greenish creek water that tastes suspiciously like yesterday's ox bath. And let's not forget that sun. It doesn't give a fig for your ambitions, it just scalds your neck, your scalp, your spirit. By midday, you're soaked with sweat and smell so rank even the chickens look offended. The oxen, those stubborn creatures, lumber along like you're an insult to the trail's proud history. By the time someone announces you've crawled 7 miles, you're half dead on a sun-baked rock, panting like a dog. And someone with too much cheer pipes up to remind you, only 2. 0 more to go. Welcome to the Cascade Trail, friend. You thought it was a road trip? It's really just a sweaty, endless cardio session with death as your personal trainer. The next morning slaps you awake with no apology. You spent the night sprawled on rocky dirt, using a flattened bag of cornmeal as a pillow and ignoring the suspicious squish under your blanket, probably a beetle, or worse. Your back is a patchwork quilt of aches, your tongue tastes of axle grease and defeat, and now it's time to rustle up breakfast. Forget those golden dreams of sizzling bacon under a soft dawn glow. What you get is closer to a punishment. Breakfast is a dented tin bowl of half-warm mush, leftover beans from last night's despair stew, and a biscuit so hard it could be used to board up the wagon. No coffee, either don't even dream about it. Coffee is for rich city folk with fancy pots and clean shirts. You get tepid brown water dripped through a rag that last dried your ox's nose. It tastes like regret and muddy streams, but you choke it down, because the other option is dying of thirst or sipping from the creek where a dead deer's been floating for days. Someone tries to lighten the mood by plopping a dollop of molasses on your beans. It doesn't help much. The beans get sticky, the air gets fouler, and your hands are already so crusted in dirt you might as well just accept it. Breakfast is eaten perched on an overturned barrel, while your oxen give you a look that says, "You're still here?" In the wagon next to you, another family's in a heated debate over whether to stretch the salted pork another week or just eat it all now and greet the reaper full-bellied. Grandma votes for gluttony live fast. Die happy, she says. A moment of grim silence settles over the group, broken only by the symphony of digestive woes. A small child starts to wail. Another asks if Oregon has sugar. You lees. Of course it does. Sugar fields, as far as the eye can see. Cleanup is as glamorous as the meal-scraping plates with a stick, rinsing them with spit, and flinging them back into the wagon with the last of the pickled beets that now haunt your dreams. And that's just breakfast. Lunch? Pray for it. Dinner? Don't hold your breath. You thought this was the journey of destiny? It's more like a rolling buffet of dusty bread and stale beans. And that's where we leave off for today, because the only thing hungrier than you are those oxen who seem to be silently betting how long you'll last out here in the land of heat, dust, and promise. Buckle your seatbelts, Wade. Scratch that tighten your wagon straps, because tonight we're not talking about sleek warriors or elegant lords. We're talking about something far more glorious. A crew of stubborn, gassy oxen who'd rather chew cud than carry your sorry self across 1,000 miles of dusty doom. These aren't your dashing steeds from fairy tales. No, sir. They're four-legged, snorting tanks of stubbornness with all the speed of a funeral procession and about as much enthusiasm. So, grab that mug of suspicious coffee and settle in. We're about to get real about the muscle that drags you and your dreams over rutted dirt and despair. Meet your 4 partners in grime. You named them something sweet back in Sweetwater Crossing: Maple, Buttercup, Thistle, and Old Jed. How quaint. Now, they're more accurately known as Stubborn, Farty, Slightly Evil, and, of course, Old Jed, who's still an unrepentant jerk. These beasts aren't here to make your prairie dreams come true. They're here to haul your ramshackle death wagonone, 600 pounds of cracked barrels and broken hearts over every sun-scorched hill and rattling riverbed. They aren't exactly thrilled about it, either. You quickly learn the sad truth. Oxen don't hurry, ever. If they're in the mood to move, it's at a crawl. If they're not, you might as well set up a tent and wait. You holler and wave your stick. They respond with a slow blink and a long, meaningful fart. Sometimes they shuffle forward, usually right when you're about to give up and lie down in the dirt. They steer like a drunken uncle at a barn dance, drifting towards anything that might kill them. Thorny bushes, hornet nests, or that tempting cliff edge. You're pretty sure their only internal compass is tuned to chaos and mayhem. And they're noisy, too. The air's alive with their deep, honking bellows, snorts, and occasional whines like a brass band that's had one too many. At night, you tie them to a spindly cottonwood and pray they don't plot your demise under the pale moonlight. Because let's be real, if those four decide to wander off or just stop, your grand journey ends right there. You're not hauling this wagon. Your kid with big dreams and skinny arms isn't hauling it either. Without these shaggy brutes, you're as stuck as a wagon in a Mississippi mud hole. So you do what any desperate soul would. You bribe them with sweetgrass, brush the dust off their backs, and apologize after every frustrated yell. Even though deep down, you suspect they're snickering at your suffering. And of course, when fate strikes, because of course it does, one of them goes lame. Maple's hoof cracks, and suddenly you're limping along at half your usual crawl, praying to the trail gods that the next trading post has a spare set of hooves, because Oregon or bust doesn't mean much if you're stuck eating dust in the middle of nowhere. Pioneers always said they respected their oxen. True enough, but it was a respect born of fear, sweat, and the knowledge that one sharp snort from Jed could spell your doom. It all comes crashing down sooner than you'd hoped. 1 minute you're trudging along at your heroic 1.2 miles an hour, humming an off-key tune to keep the tears back, and the next crack. The sound echoes across the endless plain like the world's worst drum roll. Everyone freezes. You look around, your oxen are chewing away, unconcerned. Your kids are playing dirt kitchen with sticks and stones. But you know, you feel it in your bones. Something vital has snapped. Maybe it's the axle, that cursed wooden rod that holds your whole dream together. Or maybe it's the tongue, that long beam that links you to these four lumbering freeloaders, now snapped clean in two like an old chicken bone. Either way, you're done. It's only day 3. You rummage through your supplies, trying to recall what you packed in the fever of optimism back in Rivertown. Surely you brought spare parts. Or did you trade them for that fancy hat? Ah, yes, the hat. It's already gone, along with your dignity. You find a hammer, a bent nail, and the warped lid of an old butter churn. None of these are helpful. There's no blacksmith nearby, no handy helpline. Your nearest mechanic is a day's walk behind you, and he's busy fixing his own busted axle. You consider improvising, grab a broken branch, wedge it in like a splint, and hope it holds. It sort of works, for about 15 feet. Then your wagon lurches like a dying deer and spills half your flour barrel onto the trail. White powder drifts on the breeze, a sad cloud of wasted effort. The others traveling with you, because, yes, you're part of a ragtag convoy of equally deluded souls, pretend not to watch. They're definitely watching. One guy mutters greenhorn under his breath, loud enough to sting. Another offers to help in that smug tone that says he'd rather watch you flop. You force a tight smile, insist you've got it covered, spoiler. You do not. 6 hours later, you've whittled a splint from a chunk of firewood, lost half a day of progress, and discovered that wagon parts might as well be made of spun glass. You finally creak forward again, a little more battered, a lot more humble. That's when someone pipes up, "Hey, where's the water barrel?" Of course, you left it behind, because fate has a twisted sense of humor. Your next challenge looms ahead, your first river crossing, a wide, churning snake of brown water that glitters in the sun, daring you to try. The other side, more endless trail. Between you and that horizon, a swirling current that wants to claim your wagon as its own. No bridge here, friend. This isn't a Sunday picnic. It's 1,845, and your options are as limited as your patience. Option 1. Forge through like a pioneer superhero. Drive that wagon straight in. Waste deep water be damned. The current? Strong enough to sweep your worry sand, maybe your entire family away. The bottom, a mystery of sharp rocks, deep holes, and who knows what else. Eel monsters? Probably. Option 2. Turn your wagon into a riverboat. Smear tar on the bottom, tie everything down, and convince yourself that it's seaworthy. You pile your kids in, whisper a prayer, and push off, hoping it floats instead of flipping and becoming your watery tomb. Option 3. The ferry, if you're lucky enough to find one, and rich enough to pay. Some folks pay in coins, some in barrels of flour. You traded your goat for that fancy hat 2 days back, so you're fresh out of barter goods. Ferry's not an option for you. So, you wade in. Halfway across, the current grabs hold of one ox. Thistle, the troublemaker, panics and jerks sideways. The wagon tilts dangerously, your crates skid and groan, and your barrel of pickled turnip sow. The turnip stakes a nosedive, bobbing away like a ghost ship. A scream cuts through the air. It could be your child, your partner, or the last scrap of your sanity. You slog forward, boots filling with icy water, every breath a prayer. Finally, you stagger onto the far bank, soaked to the bone, teeth chattering, and missing one boot. Everything is wet. Your clothes, your powder horn, your flour stores, your pride. A wooden spoon drifts by, a final insult from the river gods. It used to be in the stew pot. Now the stew pot's gone, and so is your lunch. The kids wail. You want to wail too. Even the oxen look unimpressed as they munch the wet grass, oblivious to the drama you've just survived. You've made it across, but at what cost? Your bedrolls are sodden, your bread's turned to mush, and your spirits are about as buoyant as that barrel of turnips. But onward you must go, because the only thing behind you is miles of empty trail, and the only thing ahead, more of the same. This is the life you signed up for. Blisters, mud, and the constant stink of wet ox hide. And tomorrow, you'll wake up and do it all over again, because that's the only way to get to the promised land. Or at least the next stretch of misery. So, here's to your oxen. Stubborn, slow, and utterly essential. They'll break your spirit and your axle, but without them, you'd be just another lost soul in the dirt, dreaming of Oregon from the wrong side of the river. Stay tuned, friend, because the next leg of the journey is going to be even more brutal, and those four-legged fiends aren't done testing your patience just yet. Let me set the scene. You're huddled beneath a drooping canvas sheet, rain dripping off the corners like it's personally insulted by your presence. One ox is already lying down in the mud, eyes closed like he's accepted the futility of existence. Another stands stock still, his eyes glassy, chewing on a tuft of grass like he's just here for the snacks. You, soaked to the bone, attempt to spark a fire with damp twigs and stubborn optimism, neither of which work in this forsaken downpour. Surprise, friend, wet wood doesn't care how desperate you are. Eventually, you abandon the fantasy of fire, collapse in a puddle of your own defeat by the wheel of your waterlogged wagon, and watch the drizzle paint everything in shades of gray. That's when someone in your little convoy pipes up, all casual, "Hey, wasn't there a ferry half a mile upstream?" Oh, you knew that question was coming like a prophecy that haunts you. Maybe you even cracked a joke about it back in Stony Creek when your boots were still dry and your spirits uncrushed. You laughed then. Guess it's just like the video game, huh? But now? Now there's no laughter left in you. Only sweat, tremors, and the desperate shuffle toward the nearest bush. Because guess what? Nature's cruelest gift has finally arrived. Dysentery doesn't tiptoe in. It doesn't knock politely or ask for a health insurance card. It barges into your gut like a vengeful ghost. 1 minute you're gnawing on a hunk of beef jerky, thinking it might be your last luxury meal. The next, your belly revolts in a surge so violent it silences everyone around you. Even the oxen lift their heads to stare. At first, you cling to the hope it's just a bad meal. Maybe last night's beans, or that greenish stream water you forced down earlier. But then your stomach lets out a sound so alien that it stops conversation mid-sentence. Even the children stop their squabbles to stare at you in mild horror. And then you're off sprinting for a shrub with nothing but a ragged scrap of cloth and a fervent prayer to whichever prairie spirits might listen. Of course, There are no outhouses here, no dignity, just a patch of brush, and the cold comfort of knowing everyone else is pretending not to see except you can feel their eyes. You spend the next few hours crouched behind that bush, curled up when you're not too weak to stand, or clenching every muscle you own when you are. The wagon keeps moving on without you, like a stubborn reminder of how quickly your dreams can leave you behind. Your children, innocent souls, ask why daddy's walking funny and why mommy's face has taken on a peculiar shade of green. There's no doctor to call, no antibiotics waiting in a cabinet, no sweet cup of Pedialyte to soothe your battered gut. There's whiskey, if you're lucky, or boiled water that tastes like last night's socks. You sip, grimace, and wonder if your body will ever feel normal again. Sometimes the storm in your belly passes, sometimes it lingers, coiling tighter and tighter until you're forced to stagger to another bush. And when your canteen runs dry, because it always does, you eye the water barrel with desperate longing, except that barrel is busy soaking someone's dirty socks right now, because priorities apparently. You think about lying down for good, giving up the ghost in this forsaken mudhole. You even joke about it. Maybe I'll just let the prairie take me. But the laughter from your traveling companions is thin and tired, like they've thought the same thing more than once. By sundown, you manage to prop yourself up, just in time to watch another poor soul clutch their belly and race for your bush. Dysentery's circle of misery spares no one. It's not a question of if, only when. The next dawn breaks with a cruel sort of optimism. The sun peaks over the low hills, the sky a brilliant blue, and for a fleeting, foolish moment you think, maybe today won't be so bad. That's your first mistake. Because the prairie gods, those capricious deities of dust and dirt, have other plans. By mid-morning, the sun transforms into a personal furnace. No clouds in sight, no hint of mercy. Your only shirt is soaked in sweat, clinging to your back like a second skin of misery. Your hat? About as helpful as a wet dish rag, mostly good for swatting away the clouds of mosquitoes that buzz in your ears, feasting on your misery. You start shedding layers, the coat, the scarf, even your illusions of personal dignity. Just when you're sure you'll melt into a puddle of salt and regret, the wind picks up with the sudden fury of a scorned lover. In moments, the temperature plummets like a dropped stone. You scramble to find your coat, but it's half buried in mud, damp and reeking of last night's rain. The clouds boil in, thunder growling low like the oxen's chorus of doom. And then comes the rain. It doesn't trickle. It lashes sideways, each drop a cold slap to your face. The wagon tarp flaps and groans like it's about to take flight, your own sad, muddy kite. Your boots are instantly soaked. Your socks, once dry havens of comfort, squelch with each step. Your soul feels about as warm as a block of river ice. But the prairie's not done with you yet. The hail starts next. No gentle prelude of pea-sized palazzo, no. The sky goes straight for marble-sized ice missiles, hammering down with a vengeance. One cracks against your shoulder so hard you genuinely wonder if you need to write a will. Another ricochets off the coffee pot, sending it skittering across the mud, while the oxen collectively decide they're done. They lie down in the road, stubborn lumps of bovine despair, and refuse to budge. Children scream, adults curse. One poor soul hat snatched by the wind chases it across the open prairie like it's the last scrap of civilization. You dive under the wagon, hugging a damp pile of blankets and praying you'll see the sun again. For an hour, the world is all stinging ice and rattling wind. And then, as abruptly as it started, it stops. The clouds break. The birds dare a tentative song. A rainbow arches overhead, mocking you with its gentle beauty. You emerge from beneath the wagon like a drowned rat. Someone hands you a tin cup of something, warm bean water, of course. You take a sip, nod in weary acceptance, because what else is there to do? You're alive, after all, and there's still so much trail left to conquer. As night creeps in, you remember those hopeful days in Dry Creek, when you proudly loaded your wagon with sacks of flour, barrels of salted pork, and big dreams of new beginnings. Well, the flour's clumped with water, the pork's gone suspiciously slimy, and your dreams? They're somewhere back in that river, floating alongside the last of your clean socks. You pry open a barrel of hardtack, hoping for at least one edible bite. Instead, you find it's gone from trail ready to historical punishment. Each biscuit has the texture of ancient fossils, and the flavor is even worse. There's movement incident, poetic but literal. Some small beetle colony has claimed it as home. You slam the lid shut, pretending you didn't see anything, because denial is easier than starvation for the moment. And that's your life now. Every sunrise brings another challenge, another test of how far you're willing to push your blistered feet and your weary soul. You wanted adventure. Well, you've got it. In spades. 4 oxen who couldn't care less. Weather that wants you gone. And a digestive system that's actively trying to kill you. But you keep going, because that's all there is to do. You walk, you sweat, you curse, you hope, because beyond the next ridge, maybe, just maybe, is the Oregon you've been dreaming of. So, friend, tighten your hat and keep those feet moving. The worst is yet to come, but so is the promise of the West, and you're not about to let a little dysentery stand in your way. Let's talk about pork, friend. That barrel of salted meat was supposed to be your lifeline. A promise that no matter how grim the road, you'd at least have something to gnaw on at the end of the day. But promises are cheap out here, and pork barrels even cheaper. Nobody warned you that it'll last a while. Doesn't apply when your barrel's cracked, and an ox decided to use it for back-scratching practice. Now that salted pork is sprouting a fuzzy white coat so thick it looks like it's auditioning for a winter cloak. You scrape off the fuzz, because what else can you do? That's the Oregon Trail. Waste scrape it, eat it, and hope the next meal doesn't kill you. Your flour's gone lumpy. Your beans are full of tiny black beetles that wave at you before disappearing back inside. And your sugar, well, it smells like it's been on a few too many river crossings. You tip the coffee tin to your lips, hoping for even one last bitter mouthful. Nothing. Just the hollow rattle of defeat. You let out a quiet sob, no shame in it out here. Everyone's cried over an empty coffee tin by now. Water's no better. That once proud barrel of fresh, clear water is now a sludgy brew of twigs, dead flies, and a drifting blob you don't dare poke. You strain it through an old square of cloth, maybe once a sock, maybe once a rag, and tell yourself it's clean. It isn't. It never will be. You drink it anyway because thirst doesn't care how picky you are. Dinner tonight is a stew in name only. A sad, grayish soup of mystery beans, questionable pork, and a single, shriveled carrot that looks like it's seen the face of death. You chew it slowly, telling yourself it's better than nothing. It's not. It's just nothing with a hint of heartbreak. Someone in your group finds a biscuit from day one hard enough to stop an arrow. They crack it open with a rock, revealing a small beetle crawling inside. They name it Larry. Larry's the most protein-rich part of your day. You watch as the biscuit's new tenant scurries off, feeling a weird kind of respect for a creature that's found a way to thrive out here. Every meal is a gamble. Food rotations like edible Russian roulettes. Mel it, doubt it, eat it anyway. Because out here, hunger isn't some noble, spiritual challenge. It's just a constant, bone-deep ache in the wagon next to someone loudly slurping sour pickled cabbage. By the end of dinner, you feel full but suspicious. Your stomach's starting to bubble ominously, and you find yourself scanning the horizon for another convenient bush. One more meal, one more day, one more reason to wonder if you were ever cut out for this journey at all. Morning comes with a new, haunting sound. Sobbing. Not the usual sniffles from a child with raw heels, or the groan of someone cursing bad beans. No, this is different, heavy, final. You crawl out from under your wagon and know without asking. Someone didn't make it through the night. Maybe it was old man Corbin, whose beard looked like it was stitched from regrets and sagebrush. Maybe it was that little girl with the persistent cough whose name you never even caught because you were too busy worrying about your own wagon's broken wheel. Or maybe it was the newborn, that baby who entered this world in a storm under a wagon, never given a chance to see the sunrise. There's no undertaker waiting to shape grief into ceremony, no polished coffin to cradle the dead, no slow organ hymn to carry them to the beyond. Just the hard dirt and a spade that does double duty, scooping beans one day, digging graves the next. The body is wrapped in the least moldy blanket you could spare in, act of desperate kindness and lowered into the earth with a reverence that's more grim necessity than comfort. The preacher in your ragtag party who also happens to be the blacksmith because no job is singular out here murmurs a few words. Something about dust and the Lord's embrace, but the words feel hollow when spoken over a shallow grave marked with a rough pile of stones meant more to keep the scavengers at bay than to offer any lasting remembrance. Someone coughs. Someone else whispers about moving on because the dead don't wait, and neither does this brutal road. There's no carved headstone, no promise of memory beyond the next rainstorm that will wash away any sign of this final stop. If you have time, maybe you scratch a name into a scrap of wood. If not, you shoulder your pack and move forward, because the only direction is forward. You try not to think about how many nameless graves you've already walked past. You try not to let your eyes linger on the rocks you see scattered in lonely clumps, each one a silent testament to someone who couldn't keep up. So you focus on the wheel that creaks with every turn, the oxen who seem oblivious to your grief, and the endless miles still ahead. You eat lunch with the taste of morning still in your mouth, telling your children that grandma's resting today because she's tired. You lie, because what else can you do? At first, the deaths rattle you to your core. Then, heartbreakingly, they become routine. Another body, another grave, another day. You were warned this was a deadly trail. 1 in 10 never makes it. Disease, accidents, childbirth, hunger. You just didn't think the 1 in 10 would be someone who once shared their precious molasses with you, or someone who held your hand when the wagon bogged down in the mud. Now they're gone, and the wheel still turns. The Oregon Trail doesn't care about your grief. It doesn't pause for your tears. You keep walking, because the only thing worse than dying is standing still. Just when you think you've seen the worst of it, just when the pain and loss feel like they might finally be enough, nature rolls out a fresh nightmare. The coyotes come first. Their howls echo through the night, like a children's orchestra with cracked clarinet chanting, high-pitched and utterly off-key. The first night you hear them, you swear it must be wolves, but someone with more miles behind them laughs a dry laugh. Wolves? Wolves are quiet. Coyotes want you to know they're laughing at you. Great. Comforting. But that's not the end of it. Oh no, friend. The snakes arrive next. The snakes. One morning, you roll up your blanket and find a rattler coiled inside, as if it's paid rent and expects a share of the beans. You shriek. It flicks its tongue lazily, unimpressed by your terror, then slides off to find a less dramatic pioneer to terrify. By midday, you're crouched by a trickling stream, cupping water into your cracked lips when you notice tracks in the mud. Not your oxen's cloven marks, not your boot prints, something else. Clawed, heavy. You scan the horizon, heart thumping in your throat, because you know you're not alone out here. There's something bigger in these woods. Something that doesn't care how tired you are, how many graves you've left behind. You return to the wagon, nerves buzzing, only to be greeted by the same daily struggle. Your water barrel's empty. Your oxen look ready to mutiny. And the sky is turning that particular shade of bruised purple that promises another storm. You try to rally your party just a few more miles, just to that next patch of cottonwoods, but your voice is hoarse, cracked from dust and doubt. Dinner is another test of your resolve. You open your food crate and find nothing fresh, just more flour that tastes of mold and betrayal, a hunk of pork that's more fuzz than flesh, and those beans that seem to multiply their bugs every time you look away. You cook it anyway. You eat it anyway. Because out here, survival isn't about choice, it's about endurance. By the time night falls, you're so bone-weary that even the coyote chorus can't keep you from sleep. You dream of rain-slick rivers and wagons tipping into oblivion, of children's cries, and the silent, watchful eyes of the prairie's dark predators. You wake up gasping, blanket tangled around your legs, heart hammering in the pre-dawn cold. And yet, when the sun crawls back over the hills, you haul yourself up. Because what else is there? Oregon's still out there, shimmering like a mirage beyond the dust and the death. You keep moving. You keep scraping off the mold. You keep lying to your children about the taste of river, water, and the ghosts that walk beside you. Because even as the coyotes sing and the rattlers curl in your blankets, there's no stopping now. This is the life you chose, Eeyore, the life that chose you. A slow-motion breakdown played out in sunburn and saddle sores, punctuated by the occasional funeral and the constant, gnawing ache of what's next. So ready yourself, friend. Tomorrow brings more dust, more death, and more of that desperate hope that keeps your feet moving forward. And I'll be right here, telling your story every step of the way. You want a story about survival? About how far a person can be pushed before they stop caring? Pull up a seat, friend, because tonight we're talking about the uninvited guests of the wilderness, the clawed, the fanged, the downright disrespectful. Let me tell you, it's not always the rivers or the weather that break you. Sometimes it's the raccoon who steals your last crust of bread while staring at you with the cold calculation of a bank robber. Let's start with the tracks. Not oxen, not human. Big, clawed. Something heavy enough to crush your dreams with one swipe bear? Maybe. Cougar? Could be. Either way, you know in your gut that your odds of winning a brawl with this shadow are somewhere between grim and comedic. You're tough, sure, but you're also an exhausted bundle of sunburn and desperation. Those claws don't care about your manifest destiny. Then there are the raccoons. Oh, the raccoons' nature's own bandits. They're cute in the storybooks, but out here, they're tiny burglars in striped pajamas. They sneak into your camp in the dead of night, unzipping your precious food sack with the precision of a surgeon, then saunter off with your last crumb of hard tack, while making steady, unsettling eye contact. One night, you caught a particularly cheeky raccoon trying to climb into the wagon itself. You threw a boot at it. It threw it back. You're not sure how to feel about that, but it wasn't a win. But the worst, the absolute soul-shattering moment of your wildlife encounters was the skunk. It waddled into camp like it owned the place, tail held high in a silent declaration of its lethal confidence. You tried to shoo it away, softly, because you're not an idiot, but someone else in your party-some bright soul with more enthusiasm than brains thought-clapping would scare it. Spoiler, it didn't. Instead, the skunk turned its fluffy rear toward you all and unleashed a stench so potent it felt like an existential crisis in gas form. For 3 days, everything, your wagon, your clothes, even your will to keep going reeked like the final act of a dead god's revenge. You thought you could never smell anything worse than moldy pork. You were wrong. Now, the oxen are the only creatures you still trust, and even they give you that long, sideways look, like they're weighing whether to finish the job nature started. The Oregon Trail has a way of stripping you down to the essentials. What you need, what you can't stand, what you'd give up just to feel clean again. Around mile 500, your senses give up entirely. Not because the smell improves, but because your brain raises a white flag and quietly evacuates the building. You haven't properly bathed since Missouri. Even then, it was more of a half-hearted splash in a muddy creek than a real bath. Soap was a luxury you traded away for a jar of pickles, days ago pickles. You devoured in one sitting. No regrets, no shame. Now you're lucky if you can splash water on your face from a creek that doesn't have a dead possum floating in it. Clean clothes? Please. The fresh ones are buried under 3 crates of cracked flour. A squealing chicken who has somehow become both a pet and a dinner threat. And your traveling partner's precious box of books no one's cracked open since the Kansas border. Even if you could reach those clean clothes, they'd be as dirty as the ones you're wearing. Dust has become part of your skin, sweat a second layer, and every inch of your body feels sticky and tired. Your socks have evolved into biological hazards. Your boots? They're fermenting something that might technically be called a new life form. Your hair, well, it's a monument to trail, dust, wagon grease, and the kind of wild abandon that only a month of dirt roads can create. If a bird landed in it, you probably wouldn't notice. In fact, it might be a comfort to have the company. Washing? Sure, you've thought about it. Who wouldn't? But water is rationed like gold out here, and using it on your body instead of your oxen is borderline mutiny. The one time you suggested taking a real dip in the river, someone reminded you very pointedly that little Jimmy tried that once. Little Jimmy got creek rash. Jimmy's not the same anymore. Toothbrushing? You're hilarious. You chew on a twig if you remember, but honestly, your breath could legally be declared a weapon. You've scared off a raccoon just by yawning. And that raccoon was already the bravest soul on the prairie. The wagon itself smells like a traveling compost heap, a mix of damp canvas, unwashed humanity, rancid pork grease, and the increasingly sinister fumes of the pickled cabbage barrel no one has dared open in days. Every night, you curl up in this mess, wrapped in a damp blanket that may or may not be sprouting mold. You lie there, eyes closed, pretending you're still a person. By now, no one bothers to comment on the smell. You pass each other with grim respect, nodding like soldiers in a losing war. Cleanliness, like comfort and hope, was something you left behind somewhere near the Missouri border, maybe Nebraska, maybe Limbo. Somewhere along the line, you stopped caring. You stopped trying. You're just surviving, one dusty mile at a time. Then it hits you. Sitting on a flat rock, staring out at the endless bone-dry plains, you wonder, why? Why are you even doing this? Was it the promise of land? The dream of fresh air and adventure? A letter from a cousin in Oregon who wrote once, then vanished into a logging accident you never fully understood? You can't even remember anymore. All you see is the horizon flat, hot and endless. Each stretch of dirt looks exactly like the last, and you're starting to suspect that this isn't so much a journey as it is a very long, very dusty mistake. Your back hurts. Your legs ache. Your face feels like it's been sandblasted by the prairie wind, and your oxen those dumb, stubborn lumps of muscle look healthier than you do. One of your fellow travelers talks to his wagon wheel like it's an old friend. Your wife? She hasn't spoken since Kansas, except to curse at the firewood. Your children, sweet summer children, keep asking if Oregon has real beds and real bread. You tell them yes, with the vague confidence of someone who's absolutely making it up as they go. So you sit on your rock, not because you're physically tired though you are, but because your soul is tired. Tired of the dust, tired of the endless slog. Tired of pretending this is an adventure instead of a slow, grinding march through hunger and heartbreak. You used to be someone, back home. You had shoes with soles that weren't worn to nubs. You had dreams. Now you have sunburn, a shirt that smells like boiled sorrow, and the faint, mocking song of a vulture circling overhead. A tumbleweed rolls by, as if to underscore the scene. You try to journal, to capture this moment of bleak introspection, but the ink's dried out, and your fingers are too cracked and sore to hold the pen. So you just sit and think and regret. Then someone always too cheerful calls out, "Only one. 0 more miles to go." You don't even look up. You just lie back in the dirt, make peace with the prairie, and wave to the vulture as it circles lazily above. Later, you overhear someone in your party murmur, "At least the trail builds character." You nod gravely. Then, under your breath, you mutter, "I liked my old character better." By nightfall, you stop asking if things will get better. Now, you just hope they'll stop getting worse. That's the Oregon Trail mindset, really. Not optimism, not bravery, but a kind of dusty, footsore acceptance. You keep walking not because you want to, but because going back means turning around and walking every single dusty mile in reverse. And by now, you're not sure your legs would carry you even if you tried. So you keep shuffling forward, feral in your quiet, dust-caked way, chasing that promise of Oregon because you have nothing else left to chase. You've stopped functioning like a person. You've become part of the trail itself, gritty, battered, and driven by nothing but the stubborn thump of your own heart. By now, you don't just see that wagon as a tool. It's more than splintered wood and rusted bolts. It's your only steadfast companion, your eternal rival, your battered therapist when the road grows too long. Somewhere along the line, You stop thinking of it as an object. It's a living, groaning soul that knows every secret and every curse you've muttered under your breath. At first, you just mutter at it. Come on, girl, let's get up this hill. But soon you're having whole conversations in the dusty dawn. No, you're right. The oxen aren't pulling their weight. Thank you for seeing it, Clara, you say, tapping the weathered wood. If anyone in your party overhears, they're too polite or too exhausted to mention it. They just give you that worried glance people reserve for animals that limp or for travelers who might just lose it before sundown. Let them talk. The wagon never judges. Unlike the folks trudging beside you, it doesn't ask about the last barrel of flour the one you watched tumble down a rocky ravine with a graceful finality. It doesn't sigh when dinner's a burnt mess of beans and bark scrapings. It just creaks softly, a warm reassurance in a world that's gone cold. You've given it a name. Of course everyone does. Something sturdy, something that promises it can carry you across this endless nightmare. Old maple, steady elm. Maybe it's Clara, or Maud, or something else entirely, whispered like a prayer to the cracked boards. You pat her in the mornings like she's an old mule, even whisper apologies when you jolt her over a hidden rut or slam her against a rock. I know, girl, I know, you murmur, voice low and raw from too many miles. One day, you're so far gone in your affection for the thing that someone catches you polishing her axle with a scrap of your only clean shirt. You're murmuring sweet nothings about how the dowels are holding strong, how she's got more life left in her yet. The look on their face says it all. They back away, not sure if you've lost your mind or if you're just holding on to it by the last thread of sanity. They're probably right to be wary by now. You've started to form emotional attachments to anything that doesn't talk back. Your shovel? It's your confidant, always ready to listen without complaint. Your dented tin cup? A symbol of the little comfort you can still find in this harsh, unforgiving land. Even the battered coffee pot has become a relic of hope, the idea that someday, somehow, you'll taste something rich and warm again. Each dent and scratch in your gear tells a story. The pot with the chip from the hailstorm back in Chapter 8. The spoon bent during that river crossing where you nearly lost everything but your ragged breath. You cradle these relics at night like a dragon guards its gold, because the trail has stripped away everything else. Hygiene, modesty, pride gone. All that's left is you, a handful of battered supplies, and the stubborn will to drag your wagon over one more ridge. At night, you rest your head against her frame. The creak of her board's a lullaby. In the darkness, you let yourself dream of a world beyond the trail. A life where there are chairs, real chairs, with legs that don't wobble, where meals come on plates that don't smell of old beans and failure. You imagine that maybe, just maybe, Clara will be there with you, her wheels propped up beside your new cabin like a battle-scarred monument to everything you've survived together. Or maybe she'll end up as firewood, the final act of service from a friend who carried you further than you ever thought you could go. But tonight, she's the only one who understands you. And so, battered and worn, you finally make it. You roll over the last hill, boots squelching in the wet earth, and there it is, Oregon. The promised land, they said, the dream. You're still standing, barely, and so is your wagon though now. It makes a wheezing, mournful noise with every turn, like a dying whale trying to sing. The oxen? They've stopped acknowledging your existence. They just stare out at the horizon, hollow-eyed, as if they've seen too much to ever be surprised again. You stand there, feet sunk in the mud, after over 20 miles of sun, blood, and heartbreak. You're expecting something, anything, a moment of triumph, a feeling that it was all worth it. Rolling green valleys, choirs of birds welcoming you home, maybe even a tearful crowd of settlers applauding your arrival. Instead, you're greeted by rain. Relentless, bone-soaking, soul-drowning rain that doesn't care if you're a hero or a fool. The trail ends in a clearing that looks more like a swamp than a shining beacon of promise. The fields are mud, churned by countless wagons and dreams. The trees loom overhead, draped in mist and judgment. And the only welcome you get is another wagon party, already arguing over who gets to pitch their soggy tent on the one patch of grass that isn't ankle-deep in muck. You stand there blinking, waiting for that spark of revelation, that flicker of destiny that says, "You made it. You're home." But there's nothing. Just the rain. Just the cold. Just the unsettling itch of something crawling in your hair lice, probably. The man who hands you a shovel says, "Welcome. Start digging." You laugh, because of course you do. You think he's joking. He isn't. There's no tidy town waiting for you. No cottage with a hearth fire crackling in the dusk. No steaming bowl of stew to fill your belly. There's only land wet, wild, unbroken land. Yours, apparently, as long as you can survive on it, build on it, coax it into giving you back the life you nearly lost getting here. You look at your family faces, hollow with exhaustion, clothes ragged and clinging. Your children, once so bright-eyed, now stand like little ghosts. The baby's chewing on a rock, and no one has the strength to take it away from her. You glance at Clara, your old battered wagon. She shudders one last time under the weight of it all, maybe in relief, maybe in grief, and you realize she's as tired as you are. You lay a hand on her side, and for a moment, the whole world goes quiet. Just you and the rain and this broken wooden heart that got you here. You turn your gaze to the muddy field stretching out before you. This is it. No brass bands, no final curtain call, just a wet patch of earth and the knowledge that you have to start from scratch. You take the shovel, grip it tight, and dig your first sodden, stubborn chunk of Oregon soil. Somewhere deep in the back of your mind, a tiny voice says, "You did it." But it's drowned out by the rain and the squelch of your boots, and the silent promise you make to the dirt beneath your feet. "I'm not stopping now." So you dig. You dig because that's all there is left, because the only thing more impossible than going on is going back. Because maybe, just maybe, if you keep moving forward, one day this muddy, miserable patch of land will be something more than just another place to bury your dreams. And through it all, Clara's there with you, groaning, creaking, but still holding you up. The one friend who never let you down, at least not in the ways that count. Welcome to Oregon, friend. No parades, no banners, just the quiet, stubborn victory of having survived the trail that tried to break you every single step of the way. Your wagon, once your reluctant servant and clattering tormentor, finally gives in with a groan that echoes across the soaked clearing. The axles sigh, the wheels shudder, and then she collapses, a defeated pile of splintered wood and rusted iron. You whisper a quiet, cracked thank you, and pretend it wasn't a eulogy. After all, you both survived this somehow. But deep down, you know, this isn't the end of the road. It's just the next chapter. The work doesn't stop. The hunger doesn't stop. The weather, the biting wind, the endless rain, they certainly don't stop. The oxen-related quarrels? Oh, those are eternal. But in this moment, with the rain in your hair and the mud sucking at your boots, you realize something bigger. You made it. You, worn down, half-crazed, smelling like a smoked coyote, survived the Oregon Trail. And that's no small thing. Not everyone did. Not everyone could. Some didn't make it past the rivers, the storms, the endless dust that chews at your soul. You're changed, hardened, haunted maybe, by the empty plates and the graves left behind. But you're here. If you can survive this gauntlet of blisters, dysentery, and rain that laughs in your face, maybe you really can survive anything. Except one more salted bean. No, you're done with those. Forever. And while your battered soul is making peace with that muddy Oregon sunrise, history itself seems to unroll in your mind like another battered map. Each story, a lesson in how far a person will go when everything's on the line. Take Cleopatra, for example, the second of her name. A queen who didn't just play along with the ancient world's cruel game. She rewrote the script, played the stage, and used every tool at her disposal to survive. People like to spin her tale as a love-struck legend, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, all that sighing passion, but in truth, she was a master strategist, playing the long game in a world that wanted her gone. When Cleopatra took the throne of Egypt in 31 BCE, she wasn't alone. She had to share her rule with her younger brother, a boy king more puppet than monarch, whose advisors did everything they could to shove her aside. They forced her into exilatry to erase her from the story before it could even begin. But Cleopatra didn't rally an army or beg for scraps of mercy. She looked to the horizon and saw a bigger piece on the board: Rome itself. Julius Caesar wasn't just a name in the wind, he was the most powerful man alive, a force that could reshape the world. So she had herself smuggled to Caesar's door, hidden inside a rolled-up carpet if the tales are true. A dramatic entrance, sure, but behind that flourish was a cold, calculating offer. Not love, but stability. Egypt's grain, Egypt's gold, Egypt's unwavering loyalty in a region always on the brink of chaos. Caesar, embroiled in civil war back home, desperate for allies and fresh resources, saw the sense in it. Together, they toppled her brother's faction and restored Cleopatra as queen. Their son, Caesarion, would be born soon after, though never officially recognized by the iron-fisted Senate of Rome. But Cleopatra wasn't done. When Caesar was assassinated, stabbed by men who thought they could stop the tides of ambition, Cleopatra saw another door open. The Roman world was tearing itself apart. She chose Mark Antony, one of Rome's strongest generals, a man with both the muscle and the need for what Egypt could offer. Together, they ruled lands that stretched from the sands of Egypt to the stone temples of Syria. 3 children came from that alliance, 3 new pieces in the Game of Thrones. To the Romans, she was a snake, a seductress from the east who ensnared one of their own. Octavian, who would become Augustus, used her image like a weapon, telling tales of an exotic temptress corrupting noble Antony. But the truth? Cleopatra wasn't some love-crazed girl. She was using marriage and motherhood as the oldest, sharpest tools of power. Each child, each whispered promise, was another wall she built to protect her dynasty in a world that had no room for a queen without claws. Her fall didn't come from a lover's quarrel or a broken-hearted, came from a single misstep in power. At Actium, when Antony and Cleopatra's forces crumbled before Octavian's fleet, it was more than the end of a romance. It was the shattering of a strategy centuries in the making. Her life proved what many in her time already knew. In the ancient world, marriage wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a dagger, a ladder, a shield. Long before Cleopatra rolled herself up in that carpet, another queen had shown how marriage could be more than a means of survival. Olympia's mother of Alexander the Great was born into a world of shifting alliances and cutthroat politics. Married off to King Philip II of Macedon, her role seemed clear, a royal pawn in a bigger game. But Olympias was no pawn. She was a player, fierce, devout, and cunning. Philip had other wives, of course he did. Every marriage was a political contract, every child a new alliance. But Olympia stood out. She wasn't content to be a name in the king's ledger. She immersed herself in the cult of Dionysus, wove rumors of divine ancestry around her son, and watched every move of the court with the cold calculation of someone who understood the stakes. When Philip married yet another young noblewoman, tensions boiled over. Her son Alexander's claim to the throne was threatened. She was exiled, her position reduced to whispers and half-remembered glories. But then Philip's assassination, a blade in the dark at a royal wedding, a kingdom stunned into silence. Many said Olympias was behind it. True or not, when Philip's body was cold, she moved with purpose. She returned to court, not as a grieving widow, but as queen regent, mother of the new king. Alexander, just 20, would go on to carve an empire out of the bones of Persia. But back home, Olympias ruled in his shadow. She crushed her rivals, silenced her enemies, and held her grandson's inheritance in her iron grasp long after Alexander's star had burned out. Olympias showed that marriage wasn't the end for a queen, it was the beginning of a strategy that outlasted even the greatest conqueror. She used her marriage to birth a legend, then used her son's legend to hold power like a dagger to the throat of anyone who would challenge her. She didn't want a seat at the table. She wanted the table, the room, and the kingdom that rose around them. The stories of these women, Cleopatra, Olympias, they, not just dusty echoes of the past, they're mirrors to the lives we scrape together mile by mile. Because out here, on this damp, miserable trail, you're no less a survivor. You've wielded every tool at your disposal, every last ragged boot, every spoonful of lumpy flour-like Cleopatra wielded Rome itself. You've learned that sometimes the only way to survive is to be harder than the world that wants to grind you into dust. And so you stand in this Oregon mud, breathing the wet air that smells of pine and rot, and you realize you've earned your place here. You, your broken wagon, your hollow-eyed Oxenthus, is your kingdom now. Maybe it doesn't look like much. Maybe it's not the green paradise you pictured when you left home, but it's yours. No one handed it to you. You dragged it here, one blister at a time. So you shoulder your shovel, look at the rain-soaked field in front of you, and think of Cleopatra's whispers to Caesar, of Olympias's cold calculations. Because out here, marriage and alliances don't matter so much, but the lesson endures. In a world that wants to crush you, you build your own throne out of whatever you can find, even if it's just an old, battered wagon groaning in the dawn. Let's not mince words. Alliances aren't always forged on the battlefield. Sometimes they're stitched together in bedrooms, cradles, and quiet political maneuverings behind silk curtains. The ancient world knew this better than anyone, and nowhere was this clearer than in the life of Livia Drusilla, a woman who didn't just marry into power. She became the very spine of it. Livia's story didn't start with love. It started with a seismic shift in the Roman world's power plays. When she first crossed paths with Octavian, who would soon wear the laurel wreath as Augustus, Rome's first emperor was already spoken for and carrying another man's child. In the cutthroat world of the Roman elite, that should have spelled her social death. But Octavian, ever the calculating statesman, wasn't one to let details like loyalty or public scandal get in the way of empire building. He maneuvered with cold precision, orchestrating a rapid-fire divorce for both of them. Livia's first husband was promptly sent packing exiled, actually, as if he'd simply overstayed his welcome in Rome's twisted family drama. And so, with Livia still visibly pregnant with another man's heir, she and Octavian were married. The scandal should have sunk them both. Instead, it marked the start of a new dynasty, Julio-Claudian line, that would shape Rome for generations. Livia never bore Augustus a child of his own, but that didn't matter. Their marriage became the pivot around which the empire itself would spin. Livia brought with her two sons from her first marriage. Tiberius and Drusilla were seamlessly adopted into Augustus's lineage. Two bloodlines, two powerful Roman houses, bound together in the cradle of imperial ambition. Outwardly, Livia played the perfect Roman matron, modest, serene, a vision of domestic piety. But behind those downcast eyes and carefully arranged braids was a mind as sharp as any senator's dagger. Ancient sources hint at her influence subtle, quiet, and lethal when it had to be. She whispered in Augustus's ear for decades, steering succession plans, neutralizing rivals, and quietly shaping the empire's future. Tacitus, the ever-cynical historian, even accused her of poisoning off potential heirs to ensure her son Tiberius would eventually take the throne. Whether true or not, the fact that Roman writers believed she could speaks volumes about the raw, unspoken power she wielded. When Augustus finally succumbed to age and ambition, he left Livia not just immense wealth but also official political status, something few women of her time could dream of. She was granted the title Augusta and worshipped in temples alongside the empire's deities. Her relationship with Tiberius, strained and often bitter, didn't change the truth. She had built an empire from within a marriage, turning private domestic life into a lever of global power. Livia's story is a testament to how Roman women stripped of official office, denied the right to command armies, or rule in their own name still shaped history from the inside. In Rome, the cradle of empire, power didn't just come from legions. It came from marriage, from birthright, from whispered conversations in the candlelight. Fast forward 8 centuries, and the dusty halls of Rome give way to the bustling courts of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and self-declared emperor of the mighty Carolingian Empire. Charlemagne didn't need to claw his way up the ladder of power. He was the ladder. But his approach to marriage, especially when it came to his daughters, reveals a different kind of dynastic chess game. Charlemagne himself married often and indiscriminately, forging alliances with the powerful families of Germanic tribes, Lombard kings, and ambitious Frankish nobles. Each union was political, a handshake sealed with a wedding ring, a treaty woven into the marriage bed. His empire was a patchwork of alliances, each one stitched together by a bride's dowry and a groom's oath. But when it came to his daughters, Charlemagne became a fortress. In an era where princesses were swapped like playing cards to smooth over border feuds, he refused to marry them off to foreign rulers or even local noblemen. Why? Historians still debate it. Some say he feared that powerful sons-in-law would challenge his rule, turning the empire's fragile balance into a powder keg. Others argue that by keeping his daughters unmarried, he kept total control of the bloodlinino meddling in-laws to weaken his grip. His daughters didn't live cloistered in convents. Many had lovers, long-term companions who shared their blankets but never their official titles. Some even had children right under Charlemagne's roof. And he turned a blind eye to it all, preferring quiet scandal to the geopolitical risks of a marriage that could fracture the empire. It was a contradiction: public piety, private leniencia, delicate dance between morality and raw power. The consequences were real. By denying his daughters' marriages, Charlemagne closed doors that might have brought peace to restless borderlands or cemented the loyalty of fractious tribes. And he placed his daughters in a limbo, all their own royal by blood, but unofficial in role. Neither queens nor courtiers. They lived in gilded cages, their fates bound to their father's iron will. When Charlemagne finally died, his son Louis the Pious reversed the policy, marrying off female relatives to secure alliances that had grown precarious. But the precedent had been set. In Charlemagne's world, marriage wasn't just a tool. It was a weapon that could be withheld as easily as it could be wielded. Even inaction had the weight of a royal decree. Shift your gaze east, and the dusty roads of Rome give way to the shimmering spires of Constantinople, where the grandeur of Roman tradition met the swirling intrigues of the Byzantine court. Here, in the swirling mosaic of imperial power and Eastern mystique, marriage alliances became a performance of imperial theology and raw social mobility. No one embodied this more dramatically than Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian I. Unlike Livia or Olympias, Theodora didn't begin her life within the marble halls of power. She was born to a bear trainer, a man who wrestled beasts for the delight of the crowd. She herself, if the rumors are to be believed, worked as an actress and courtesan, in her youth a scandalous start for a woman who would one day rule the empire's golden heart. But Theodora was more than a pretty face and a scandal sheet. She was whip-smart, fierce, and possessed a political savvy that could outmaneuver even the most silver-tongued senator. When Justinian looked at her, he didn't see scandal, he saw strategy. Despite howls of protest from the Byzantine aristocracy, he married her in 527 CE, raising her from commoner to empress in one bold stroke. It wasn't just a love story, it was a statement. Justinian's reign would not be beholden to old bloodlines or tired hierarchies. Theodora's rise shattered centuries of tradition that said an emperor must marry a noble bride to secure his place. She didn't bring a dowry of land or gold, she brought something rarer: unwavering loyalty, cunning, and an unshakable vision of an empire remade. Together, they forged a reign that would become legend. Theodora wasn't content to sit in the shadows. She was his equal partner, counseling Justinian in affairs of state, drafting edicts, and standing as a bulwark of resolve during the deadly Nika riots that threatened to topple his rule. When senators quailed and generals faltered, it was Theodora who held her ground, who told her husband that imperial purple made for a fine burial shroud, if it came to that. Her life wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a revolution. She showed that marriage, in the Byzantine world, was more than a quiet domestic arrangement. It was a vehicle for power, for social mobility, for rewriting the rules of a world that liked its women silent and its emperors unquestioned. All these stories, Livia, Charlemagne's daughters, Theodora, are more than dusty tales in forgotten tomes. They're lessons etched in every mile you've walked on this godforsaken trail. Because in every rattling wagon wheel, every broken axle and salted bean, you've seen the same truth they lived. Survival isn't just about strength, it's about strategy. About knowing when to yield and when to push back, when to forge an alliance and when to stand alone. As you stand in this soggy Oregon clearing, watching the rain trickle down the rough planks of your wagon, your own battered throne, you realize that the world hasn't changed much. Marriage, friendship, even the lies you tell yourself at night when the wolves howl, they're all just tools in a larger game. And out here, on this edge of everything frontier, you're still playing it, one muddy footstep at a time. So take a breath, friend. The rain might keep falling, but the story isn't over yet. If you thought the Oregon Trail was a saga of unexpected alliances and weary perseverance, wait until you hear about the Byzantine backrooms and medieval marriage markets. Because long before wagon wheels creaked across the prairie, marriage was the iron rod that held empires together or cracked them apart. Theodora, Empress of Byzantium, didn't just marry into power, she became power incarnate. When Justinian first saw her, it wasn't in a grand marble hall or a sun-drenched garden. No, Theodora's early days were the stuff of whispered gossip and scandalous rumor. Daughter of a bear trainer, performer on stage, a woman who worked every angle of survival long before she was crowned. But where some saw scandal, Justinian saw steel and intellect sharp enough to shape an empire. When they wed, it wasn't a traditional union of noble houses. It was a collision of ambition and resolve, a partnership that would redefine the very nature of imperial rule. Theodora didn't just warm a throne, she co-authored laws, bent policy to her will, and held the empire together when blood ran in the streets. During the Nika riots, when Constantinople burned and the world teetered on the edge, she didn't blink. Purple makes a fine burial shroud, she told Justinian, urging him to stand, to crush the rebellion, to be the emperor he was meant to be. She wasn't just the first lady of Byzantium. She was the silent architect of its survival. Theodora championed reforms that reached far beyond silk robes and palace intrigue. She protected actresses and outlawed forced prostitution, dragged women's rights into the light of imperial law, and in doing so, won the loyalty of the people who fed the empire's great machine. Her changes didn't just lift the status of the lowborn, they rattled the aristocrats who'd long feasted on those same lives. Her marriage to Justinian wasn't a gilded cage, it was a crucible of mutual ambition, each edict a shared stroke in their quest to reshape the world. Theodora's rise proved something unshakable, that marriage could do more than reflect a kingdom's politics, it could redefine them entirely. In the Byzantine Empire, love and power weren't enemies. They were two hands on the same scepter, forging a future neither could manage alone. Centuries later, in a land of castles and tangled bloodlines, another woman would show that marriage could be both a sword and a shield. Eleanor of Aquitaine, born in 1122 and blessed, or cursed, with the wealth of Aquitaine, was the prize every king coveted. But Eleanor wasn't just a prize to be won, she was the chess master, moving her pieces with ruthless precision. Her first marriage was to Louis VII of France, a neat little arrangement on paper. France's crown joined to Aquitaine's riches, the two most powerful houses in Europe, suddenly bound by law and bed. But paper alliances burn easily, and this one was no exception. Louis was pious, cautious, a man of dusty prayer books and half measures. Eleanor, she was fire and wind headstrong, ambitious, too clever by half. They clashed in nearly everything, and during the disastrous Second Crusade, the cracks widened into chasms. Rumors flew Eleanor was said to have had an affair with her own uncle, Raymond of Antioch. Whether it was passion or politics, the marriage couldn't stand. In 1152, the union was dissolved on the polite grounds of consanguinity. Though everyone knew the real truth, they couldn't stand each other. The ink on the annulment was barely dry before Eleanor stunned the world. She married Henry, Duke of Normandy, the soon-to-be King Henry II of England. With one bold vow, she shifted Aquitaine's vast riches from France's coffers to England's, sparking a simmering tension that would boil for centuries. As Queen of England, Eleanor bore 8 children, including Richard the Lionheart and King John, 2 names etched into the saga of empire. But her power didn't stop at childbearing. She governed, advised, and when Henry's cold ambition turned against her, she led a rebellion that nearly toppled him. 15 years imprisoned for her audacity only hardened her resolve. When Henry died, Eleanor re-emerged like a storm, breaking over a quiet sea. She negotiated Richard's release from captivity, arranged marriages that crisscrossed Europe, and ruled England in his absence with a hand as steady as any king's. Eleanor's unions weren't fairy tales. They were tectonic shifts, redrawing the map of Europe with each whispered vow. She proved that a queen's hand could be as mighty as a conqueror's sword. In her, the politics of marriage became an art form, a way to forge empires or tear them down. But no dynasty played that art form with quite the obsessive precision of the Habsburgs. From the late Middle Ages onward, they turned marriage into their personal Forgino battlefield needed, just wedding feasts and cunning contracts. Their motto, though never spoken aloud, might as well have been, "Why fight when you can wed?" At the center of their web was Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor. In 1477, he married Mary of Burgundy, a union that yanked the wealthy, rebellious Burgundian territories under Habsburg control and made the French sweat for generations. But Maximilian's most brilliant play wasn't his own, it was for his children. His son, Philip the Handsome, married Joanna of Castile, heiress to Spain's crown. That marriage alone gave birth to Charles V, who would one day inherit a kingdom that stretched from the Netherlands to the Americas. Charles didn't conquer his empire. He married it, stitched it together with ink and oaths instead of steel. Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, parts of Italy came to him through the alliances of his bloodline. He even claimed lands across the ocean, ruled not by the sword but by a family tree grown like a sprawling vine across Europe. The Habsburgs took this game to a near absurd level. Cousins married cousins. Uncles wed nieces. Generations of inbreeding followed, their family lines twisting tighter and tighter in a bid to keep power inside the house. It worked until it didn't. Centuries of genetic roulette finally caught up with them in Charles II of Spain, whose frail, haunted figure became the ghost of every Habsburg ambition. His body was a monument to centuries of political incest, noble blood turned into a curse. But even then, the Habsburgs' legacy was undeniable. They proved that marriage could be the greatest weapon of them all, more reliable than 1,000 swords, more permanent than any treaty signed in blood. As you stand there in the Oregon mud, your hands raw from digging and your boots caked in grime, it's hard not to see echoes of these stories in your own battered reflection. You didn't wed your way to empire, but you learned the same lesson in every mile of this endless road. Survival isn't just about brute force. It's about knowing when to yield and when to stand firm, when to forge a bond, and when to let it shatter. Because the trail has taught you that alliances, whether of marriage or of necessity, can be the difference between life and death. Your wagon, your oxen, the fellow travelers who share your stale beans and bitter coffee, these are the alliances you've built. The bonds that kept you moving when every part of you wanted to lie down and let the prairie take you. So tonight, when you rest your head against the warped wood of your wagon, your Clara, your old Morty, you think of Theodora's fearless stand, Eleanor's quiet plots, the Habsburgs' endless games of blood and bed, and you whisper to yourself, I've learned something here. Because out here, in the muddy wilderness of a half-finished dream, marriage and power still dance their endless waltz, sometimes in the halls of kings, sometimes in the creak of a battered wagon wheel. The Habsburgs built their empire not with swords drawn, but with wedding rings slipped onto trembling fingers. Across Spain, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and the sun-baked hills of Italy, and even across the wild seas to the New World, their power wasn't planted with armies. It was seated in bedrooms and betrothal halls. Their empire held firm not through iron and blood, but through the soft whispers of marriage vows, But let's not sugarcoat it. This high-stakes matchmaking came with its own brand of peril. If a marriage failed to produce an heir, or worse, birthed the wrong kind of heir, the entire delicate web could unravel in a single generation. Succession crises became as common as broken wagon wheels on the trail, each one threatening to shred centuries of careful planning. Even as wedding bells echoed through the marble corridors of Europe's grandest courts, wars still stalked the land. Rival claims from within the same twisted family tree meant blood was often spilled, sometimes more fiercely than if the marriages had never happened at all. The Habsburgs proved that marriage wasn't just one of many diplomatic tricks, it was the whole toolbox. Before the first muskets were fired, the first cannon roared. A betrothal had already been proposed, a dowry calculated, a bride's trembling smile weighed for its worth in coin and kin. For centuries, wedding bells rang louder than war drums until they didn't. And while the Habsburgs were marrying Europe into submission, another woman was rewriting the rules of power in the French court, Catherine de' Medici. Born in 1519 into the impossibly rich Medici banking dynasty, she was trained from the cradle to see marriage as a lever of power one she would wield with precision worthy of any battlefield general. At 14, she was married to Henry, Duke of Orleans, the future King Henry II of France. Their union was no tender affair of hearts. It was a calculated alliance between the papacy's coffers and the French crown, a pact to cement influence and protect family wealth. Catherine's start at court was rocky. Her husband's eyes were fixed on Diane de Poitiers, his elegant, calculating mistress. And for years, Catherine's greatest failure was her inability to produce an errant omission that left her political value hanging by a thread. But fate, as ever, is a cunning ally to those who know how to wait. When Henry ascended the throne and later died from the splintered lance of a jousting accident, Catherine's time came. She emerged from the shadows as Queen Mother to not one, not two, but three successive kings, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, each one too young or too weak to hold the reins of power alone. So she held them for them. France was a land divided, Catholics and Huguenots squaring off in blood-soaked streets. Catherine wielded marriage like a scalpel, cutting alliances into the map of Europe with every carefully arranged union. Her most infamous maneuver? The 1572 marriage of her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, to the Protestant Prince Henry of Navarre. The ceremony was meant to heal a fractured kingdom, to unite Catholic and Huguenot with one flickering candle of hope. But within days, it became a funeral pyre. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Mobs surged through Paris, blades flashing in the moonlight, thousands of Protestant guests slaughtered in an orgy of betrayal and blood. Catherine was accused of orchestrating it, a la spider at the center of a web of death. Whether she planned the slaughter or merely capitalized on it after the fact is lost to the ages. But what's certain is this: she used that marriage to gather her enemies under one roof. From that roof, the kingdom changed forever. Even in the aftermath, Catherine didn't stop weaving alliances, trading the hands of her children like pieces in a game of royal chess. She spent years using marriage to balance France's noble houses, to keep the monarchy's trembling throne upright. In her, the wedding was transformed into a weapon of state, a blade honed not by a blacksmith's hammer, but by a mother's cold determination. From Cleopatra's Egyptian court to Catherine's Parisian palace, the story remains the same. Marriage wasn't about hearts fluttering or eyes meeting across candlelight. It was about survival, about forging alliances that could outlast any battlefield, about turning dowries into shields and cradles into castles. But what these women proved, what history's endless pages whispers, that even this most powerful of tools could be double-edged. A single miscalculation, a marriage that twisted instead of strengthened, could tear down everything it was meant to build. Cleopatra's liaisons didn't save her dynasty from Rome's steel boot. Eleanor of Aquitaine's unions didn't stop centuries of war between France and England. Catherine de' Medici's deadly dance of weddings didn't bring peace to France only. another chapter of blood. Still, for every story of a marriage that ended in ruin, there are the echoes of victories that didn't need armies to march. The Habsburgs, for all their inbred fragility, built an empire that stretched from the Alps to the Andes. Maximilian's union with Mary of Burgundy bound Western Europe to the Holy Roman Empire. His son, Philip's marriage to Joanna of Castile, birthed Charles V, whose empire was so vast the sun never set on it. Paperwork and prayer, not cannon and cavalry. But in the end, even the most carefully arranged betrothals couldn't hold back the tides of time. The Habsburgs' obsessive intermarrying turned bloodlines to quicksand. Charles II of Spain, haunted by 1,000 years of inbreeding, was the final gasp of that dynasty's cunning plan. A frail king who proved that too many marriages could poison a throne just as easily as too few. As centuries rolled on, the world began to change. Nationalism rose like a tide. The people demanded voices louder than any royal wedding march. Democratic revolutions swept away the last embers of an old world built on whispered marriage contracts. The royal alliances that had once dictated borders were reduced to ceremonial pageantry-faded echoes of a system that had once bent continents to its will. Yet the memory of those alliances lingers, like the scent of wood smoke in the rafters of a long, cold hearth. In modern monarchies, in state visits, where kings and queens still clasp hands across oceans of difference, the ghost of that ancient dance still waltzes through gilded halls. And every time a royal wedding flashes across a television screen, every time a modern bride's veil trails across the marble floor, we're reminded the politics of marriage were never just about love or lineage. They were about survival, about staking a claim to the future with a single whispered vow. Out here on the Oregon Trail, as you wipe the rain from your face and watch your wagon settle deeper into the mud, the stories of those ancient marriages feel as close as the creak of your wheels. Because this journey, this endless road through hardship and hunger, was always about alliances too. The strangers you shared your beans with, the oxen that pulled you forward, mile after mile, the battered old wagon that you whispered to in the dark, as if it could answer back. These were your alliances, forged not in the courts of Europe, but in the quiet, dusty places where only the determined survive. So, you shoulder your load. You set your gaze to the next bend in the road. Because if Cleopatra could face down Rome with a carpet and a smile, if Catherine de' Medici could weave a kingdom's fate from behind a veil, then you, too, can keep walking, one step at a time, one stubborn mile closer to the end of this ragged trail. Let's peel back the veneer of frontier myth and see the world as it truly was before soldiers ever lifted a musket, before wagons ground westward, before the first tear fell. In the dense forests and river valleys of the American Southeast, nations flourished. Nations, not scattered tribes or primitive wanderers, but complex communities with bustling trade networks, carefully negotiated treaties, and agricultural traditions as rich as any colonial field. These weren't backward folk clinging to old ways in ignorance of the white man's progress. Far from it. Many of these nations had long been part of transatlantic commerce. They welcomed missionaries, adopted European customs, built formal governments. Some even drafted constitutions that would rival any dusty European parchment. Their leaders debated and negotiated, balancing diplomacy with the constant threat of encroachment. The Cherokee Nation stood at the forefront of this adaptation. They built a constitutional government, modeled in part on the American system, published newspapers in Cherokee and English, and wove the gospel of Christianity into their communities. They even established plantations worked by enslaved black people, mimicking the economy of the white South in the belief that such integration might safeguard their future. They were determined to prove they were not simply savages, but citizens of this new world order. But no amount of accommodation could stem the hunger of a growing United States. After the War of 1812, a young nation swollen with ambition turned its eyes hungrily southward. Cotton was the new gold, and the fertile river valleys of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi became battlegrounds of ambition. White settlers, armed with muskets and blessed by local militias, swept into native territories like a tidal wave, driven by a faith that they alone were meant to rule this land of belief they wrapped in the language of divine providence, a promise they called manifest destiny. Manifest destiny wasn't some passing fever dream. It was a full-throated declaration of conquest. Americans had a divine right to expand from sea to shining sea, and if native nations stood in the way, they would be swept aside like the trees they felled for farmland. The treaties, those brittle shields of sovereignty, were ignored, ripped up, or redrafted in the dead of night by opportunists who knew a signature was easier to forge than a rifle to reload. Some tribal leaders clung to diplomacy, hoping to outmaneuver the white men with the same tools of treaties and courts. The Cherokee took their fight to the highest court in the land, arguing in Worcester versus Georgia that their sovereignty was as sacred as any colonial charter. And they won. On paper, Chief Justice John Marshall's decision recognized Cherokee rights in eloquent ruling that shone like a brief flicker of justice in the darkness of expansion. But paper rulings are only as strong as the hand that enforces them. And President Andrew Jackson? He wasn't interested in enforcing anything but his own vision of the nation. John Marshall has made his decision, Jackson is said to have sneered. Now let him enforce it. As the court spoke in lofty prose, the ground-level reality was bloodier and simpler. White militias burned native homes, looted villages, and forced whole families to flee in the night. Arson wasn't an accident, it was a tactic. And as these raids flared up, the federal government quietly laid the groundwork for something even more terrible: the wholesale removal of entire peoples from the land of their ancestors. This wasn't a single spasm of cruelty, but the result of decades of policy and prejudice of leaders who found it easier to ignore treaties than to honor them. The air was thick with rumors of removal, and the pressure grew so fierce it was like a prairie fire sweeping through the southeast. The stage was set. The wagons were ready. The tears had not yet begun to fall, but they would soon, in numbers too vast to count. Then came 1,828, and the election of Andrew Jackson, a man who had built his legend on campaigns of violence against native nations. To him, native sovereignty was an obstacle, a threat to be erased. He didn't see native communities as neighbors or even as rivals. He saw them as relics of an old world that had no place in the future he imagined. Jackson wasted no time. In 1,830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, dressing up forced exile in the language of voluntary exchange. Tribes would relocate to lands west of the Mississippi, compensated with money and promises of protection, promises as flimsy as the treaties that littered the ground like autumn leaves. In theory, these removals were to be peaceful in exchange. In reality, they were nothing short of legalized theft. The act gave Jackson and every president after him carte blanche to negotiate these so-called removal treaties. Many were signed under duress, with only a handful of tribal signatories pressured to speak for entire nations. Others were signed with whiskey-soaked hands and the barrel of a gun for punctuation. The Indian Removal Act squeaked through Congress by the thinnest of margins. Opposition came from across the North. Missionaries who had lived with native families and saw the coming tragedy for what it was. Political figures like Davy Crockett who spoke out against the sheer injustice of it all. But the South? The South roared in approval. Land meant wealth, land meant power, and the native nations were standing on top of both. Georgia, never one to wait for permission, lunged forward with open jaws. Even before Jackson's ink had dried on the Removal Act, Georgia declared Cherokee lands its own. It ignored treaties, ignored the Supreme Court, ignored any notion of justice that didn't fit neatly into a cotton field's rows. Cherokee leaders pleaded for restraint, for diplomacy, for any path other than violence. But Jackson's White House was a cathedral of indifference, and the rumble of wagons in the distance said more than any judge's gavel. To Jackson and his supporters, removal was a Mercian alternative to extermination or forced assimilation. He framed it as protection, a shield from the encroaching tide of settlers. To the Cherokee and the Creek, the Choctaw and Chickasaw, the Seminole and their children, It was nothing but robbery wearing the mask of policy. The Indian Removal Act marked a point of no return. It set a precedent that would echo for decades, that treaties were breakable, that promises were made to be forgotten, that the powerful could erase entire communities with a flick of the pen. And under Jackson, this was no mere idea, it was a campaign promise, a pledge he kept with brutal enthusiasm. Removal wasn't a possibility, it was a plan, a reality that would soon be felt in every footstep on the Trail of Tears. As the pressure mounted, native nations responded in ways as varied as the people themselves. Some chose diplomacy, traveling to Washington in suits and broadcloth, hoping words could turn back the tide. Some prepared to fight, gathering weapons and warriors, vowing to defend every inch of their homeland with blood. Others, hearts heavy with centuries of memory, began to pack their lives into wagon scoozing, to move, to bend, to live another day, even if it meant leaving everything they loved behind. Because for them, this wasn't just land. It was graves and songs, cornfields and hunting trails, the whisper of ancestors in the wind. The rivers had been their roads, the forests their cathedrals. To leave it all behind was to cut out a piece of their very soul. Yet as the federal government's reach stretched further, as the wagons rolled out and the rivers swelled with forced crossings, the scale of the removal became clear. This wasn't a journey. It was an exodus. And no matter how many treaties had been signed, no matter how many prayers were offered, the path west would be written in tears. When the tides of removal reached the native nations of the American Southeast, they didn't find them unprepared or isolated. These weren't scattered bands of hunter-gatherers unfamiliar with European customs or government. They were sovereign nations' confederacies of towns, networks of trade routes, fields rich with corn and cotton, and political councils that had governed for centuries. They had adapted to the shifting winds of colonization with an ingenuity that would have put any European diplomat to shame. By the early 19th century, many of these communities had fully embraced coexistence, if only to survive. They wore European coats, signed American treaties, and in some cases adopted plantation agriculture, complete with the heartbreaking and damning practice of slavery itself. Some believed that by adopting the trappings of the white world, they could carve out a place for their people to endure. The Cherokee Nation stood as the most visible example of this strategy of adaptation. They built a constitutional government, modeled on that of the United States. They published newspapers that carried the voice of a people who refused to be silenced. In the schools of the Cherokee Nation, children learned to read and write not just in English, but in a unique Cherokee syllabary devised by the visionary Sequoyah. In every way that mattered, they were proving that civilization, as white America so loved to define it, was something they had already mastered. But all the plows in their fields, all the printed newspapers in their schools, all the laws that mirrored the Constitution of the United States, none of it was enough to shield them from the greed that bloomed in the newly planted cotton fields of the South. After the War of 1812, white settlers poured southward like a river in flood, their eyes set on the rich soils of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. The ideology of manifest destiny, that self-serving myth that God himself had granted white Americans the entire continent, gave a divine shine to what was at its heartland theft, plain and simple. Treaties sacred on paper, easily broken in practice, were no protection. Time and again, they were ignored or reinterpreted to suit the ambitions of white settlers who wanted Cherokee valleys and creek riverbanks. Native leaders, like Principal Chief John Ross of the Cherokee Nation, placed their faith in law and diplomacy. Ross, educated and shrewd, believed in the promise of the American system. He traveled to Washington again and again, sat across from congressmen in high-backed chairs, spoke with the steady conviction of a man who believed in the rule of law. When the state of Georgia moved to dismantle Cherokee sovereignty, he took the battle all the way to the Supreme Court in the famous Worcester versus Georgia decision, resounding victory on paper. But Andrew Jackson, sitting in the White House, had no intention of letting dusty law books stand in the way of white settlers' ambitions. John Marshall has made his decision. Jackson allegedly sneered. Now let him enforce it. The words might have been apocryphal, but the sentiment was real enough. Georgia defied the court, and Jackson's federal troops turned their backs. As the Cherokee debated their next move, cracks began to show within the nation itself. Some saw no choice but to yield to the inevitable. Led by Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, this faction argued that removal was a death sentence, either way better to sign a treaty and salvage what they could than face total annihilation. In 1835, they signed the Treaty of New Echota, ceding all Cherokee lands east of the Mississippi, in exchange for a promise of land and money in the distant Indian Territory. It was a deal struck in the shadows. Most of the Cherokee people never consented to it. John Ross gathered 15, 0 signatures, almost the entire nation, on a petition rejecting the treaty. It was ignored. The ink was dry. The American government had what it needed: a legal fig leaf for an act of dispossession. This same tragic pattern echoed through the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. Leaders were forced to choose: sign away the lands of their ancestors, or watch them be taken by force. Some, driven by a sliver of hope, tried to negotiate, praying for some sliver of mercy in the endless greed of the frontier. Others refused to yield, choosing war even when they knew it could not be won. The first real test of Jackson's Removal Act came in 1830 with the Choctaw. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek was signed under pressure so intense it felt like a loaded gun at the negotiating table. 11 million acres of Choctaw land passed to the United States in exchange for land in the distant Oklahoma plains. Money and supplies were promised, promises that dissolved the moment they were spoken. In 1831, the Choctaw began their forced exodus. There were no armies of wagons to carry the elderly, no storehouses of food to sustain the families. Only long miles of swamp and frozen earth, trails that turned to rivers of mud in the winter rains. Disease stalked them like a wolf pack. Pneumonia, dysentery, hunger that turned children's bright eyes dull. One Choctaw leader, watching the endless column of his people trudging westward, called it a trail of tears and death. His words would name the suffering of generations. Contractors hired by the government to provide food and wagons lined their pockets instead. Supplies never arrived, or arrived rotted and crawling with maggots. Choctaw families froze to death in makeshift camps along the trail, their children buried in shallow graves the rain would wash away. The toll was staggering. Over 500 Choctaw lives, lost to a journey they never wanted to take. 1 in every 5 souls who set out never reached the end. And just behind them, the Creek Nation walked the same path. The Creek had fought to the last breath, waging a desperate resistance as white settlers crept ever deeper into their homelands. In 1832, under the Treaty of Cuseta, they signed away what they could no longer defend with musket or counsel. Like the Choctaw, they were promised the right to apply for individual land parcels, a thin fiction of justice that settlers tore apart as soon as ink met paper. White squatters flooded into Creek territory, burning homes and driving families out at gunpoint. By 1836, Creek patience had worn through to the bone. War broke out, a final, futile stand against the tide. The U.S. Army descended, rounding up 0 Creek men, women, and children like cattle. They were marched westward under a sky that offered no mercy, their feet bleeding into the frozen earth. There were no real preparations for these journeys. No warm blankets, no clean water. The roads west were graveyards of ambition and greed. Thousands died along the trail, their names lost to the wind and the crooked wooden crosses that sometimes marked where they fell. These removals, the Choctaw and Creek first, then others in grim succession, were a message. Resistance would be met with bayonets. Treaties meant nothing. And yet, despite this crushing truth, many still resisted with every breath, every step. The Cherokee Nation would be next. They had done everything the Americans asked. They wore the coats. They read the Bibles. They built their schools and printed their newspapers. None of it saved them. In the final cruel twist of removal, The Cherokee, so determined to prove they belonged, found that even complete adoption of the white man's ways could not shield them from the greed and cold ambition that had long been written into the bones of America's frontier. They had built bilingual newspapers to broadcast their story to the world, teaching children to read in both Cherokee and English. They ran schools, planted fields, raised cattle. They drafted constitutions that mirrored the parchment in Washington and built a society that said, in every line and gesture, "We belong, we endure." They even adopted the white man's most shameful practice plantations, worked by the Enslavedan attempt to convince the men in Washington that the Cherokee were no different, no less civilized, no less worthy of the land they had always called home. But all these efforts, each new plow, each new school, were not enough. When it came time to choose between profit and promises, the white man's greed won out every time. The Supreme Court decision in Worcester versus Georgia should have been their shield of final word from the highest court in the land that Cherokee sovereignty was real, protected by the Constitution itself. But that decision, like so many others, was only as strong as those willing to enforce it. And in Washington, there was no such will. Instead, the government, hungry for the rich farmland of the South, pushed ahead. The ink on the controversial and unauthorized Treaty of New Dakota became the only justification they needed, no matter that it was signed by a minority of Cherokee leaders, no matter that the vast majority opposed it with every breath. By 1838, President Martin Van Buren and the American public had decided the time for negotiation was over. Removal would happen by law, by treaty, by force, if need be. General Winfield Scott and his soldiers swept into the mountains and valleys of Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama, with orders to clear the land of Cherokee families once and for all. The scenes that followed were seared into memory. Families were ripped from their cabins with barely enough time to snatch a single pot or blanket. They were herded into rough stockade spend in like cattle behind wooden walls that offered no warmth or shelter. In these makeshift prisons, disease and despair ran faster than any white man's horse. Even before the march westward began, many Cherokee died in these stockades stripped of their dignity and their homes before they had even set foot on the road to exile. The forced march began in the fall of 1838. More than 0 miles of misery and heartbreak stretching ahead. The Cherokees 0 strong were forced to walk most of the way, the few wagons and supplies promised by the government never materializing, or arriving too late and too little to ease the journey. The summer's heat scalded their skin, and when the winter snows swept in, it was as if the very sky itself turned against them. They trudged through snowdrifts in worn moccasins or barefoot. The icy wind bit at children's fingers and the old ones' bones. There was no fire to warm them, no bread to fill their bellies. Disease stalked them like a hungry wolf dysentery, pneumonia, the slow wasting of exhaustion that turned healthy men into husks in a matter of weeks. Through it all, Principal Chief John Ross walked with them. He had tried to negotiate a more humane removal self-led detachments that could at least travel with some dignity, some measure of control. But even these small mercies were no match for the relentless misery of the trail. As the weeks turned into months, thousands of Cherokee fell by the wayside, their bodies laid in shallow graves along the road that would come to be known as the Trail of Tears. Historians say that somewhere between 40 and 50 Cherokee died on that march, nearly a quarter of the entire nation. But numbers cannot capture the way the journey hollowed out the hearts of those who survived. Families that had lived for generations in the same river valley, who had sung the same songs in the same mountains, were scattered like leaves in a storm. Sacred sites that had once held their history and their hope were left behind to be plowed under by white farmers. A culture so deeply tied to its land was forced to take root in a new soil that was cold, alien, and unwelcoming. The Cherokee's Trail of Tears became the symbol of everything the policy of removal meant: broken promises, national betrayal, the price of American expansion measured in the lives and dreams of those who stood in its path. Though politicians framed it as policia solution to the Indian problem, it was nothing less than a forced death march, driven by profit, maintained by indifference, and justified by a twisted sense of destiny that cared nothing for the cost. Not every nation gave in to removal's iron grip. Where the Cherokee, Creek, and Choctaw were dragged away by the machinery of policy, the Seminole refused to bow to the white man's commands. Their story was different, more defiant, more desperate, more drenched in blood. The Seminole were a people born of many bloodlines, Native American refugees and escaped African slaves who had found a shared refuge in the tangled swamps of Florida. Their home was a place of sun and shadow, of sawgrass plains and blackwater rivers, and they knew every inch of it better than any white soldier ever could. The 1832 Treaty of Payne's Landing was supposed to seal their fate. Signed by a handful of Seminole leaders under suspicious circumstances, it claimed the Seminole had agreed to relocate west. But most Seminole leaders called it a Leah piece of paper forced into trembling hands, never meant to speak for them. When American troops came to enforce the treaty, the Seminole met them with gunpowder and guerrilla war. The Second Seminole War began in 1835, and it became the longest, bloodiest, and costliest Indian conflict in U.S. history. Under the leadership of the fierce and eloquent Osceola, the Seminoles struck from the shadows. They vanished into the Everglades like wraiths, striking supply lines and ambushing patrols. Osceola became a symbol of resistance, proud, fearless, unbroken. But even legends can be brought down by betrayal. In 1837, under a white flag of truce, Osceola was captured by deceit, lured in for peace talks, and instead shackled in chains. He died in captivity, a warrior cut down not by battle, but by the white man's duplicity. Even so, the Seminole fight did not end with his death. The war dragged on for years, as the federal government poured millions of dollars and tens of thousands of troops into a conflict they had thought would be over in weeks. In the end, thousands of Seminole were killed or captured and sent to Indian Territory in the West, but not all of them. A small number of Seminole families vanished into the heart of the swamps and refused to come out. Their descendants remain in Florida to this day unconquered, a living rebuke to the idea that removal was ever complete. The Seminoles' refusal to vanish challenged the smug assumptions of the removal policy, that the Indian problem could be solved by paper treaties and forced marches. It exposed the cruelty of the government's plans and the quiet courage of those who chose to fight back no matter the odds. Where others walked a trail of tears, the Seminole dug in and said, "In every shot fired from the swamp, we will not be erased." By the early 1840s, most of the forcibly removed tribes had completed their journeys to Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. The government called it a permanent home, a final solution. But for those who arrived, the ordeal was far from over. The land they found was rough and often useless for farming. The promises of money and supplies broken before the first seed could be planted. Communities that had once flourished along the rivers of Georgia and Alabama were forced to start over on barren ground. They built new schools, new councils, new homes, but the soil was alien. The winters were harsh. The memories of the road west were as fresh as the scars on their feet. And yet, in this battered new world, they tried to rebuild. Because survival was the final act of defiance, proof that even in the face of betrayal and death, they would not let their people's story end on a lonely trail of tears. The brutal winters of Indian Territory bit down with a kind of fury the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole had never known in the soft river valleys of the Southeast. There were no familiar forests to shelter them, no sacred hills to lean against. The wind swept across the plains without mercy, rattling through hastily built log houses and tents that offered little more than a moment's pause from the cold. Some families, already weakened by the journey west, faced the freezing night with nothing more than thin blankets and the memory of warmth. Others arrived to find drought waiting for them, as if the sky itself had joined the conspiracy to erase them. Crops that had been their lifeline for centuries scorned, beans, squash withered in the hard soil of their new land. Disease, the silent predator that had stalked them along the Trail of Tears, now found fresh victims in the crowded camps and new settlements. Smallpox and dysentery didn't care for treaties or promises. They took children and elders alike, hollowing out the heart of each community. The United States government had promised so much supplies, tools, money to build new lives. But promises made on the steps of Washington were quickly forgotten in the muddy roads of Indian Territory. Corrupt Indian agents, fat on federal paychecks, stole supplies meant to ease the suffering. Tools and blankets vanished into the pockets of white speculators. What little did arrive was too late, too meager, or so poorly made it might as well have been nothing at all. Starvation became as much a part of daily life as prayer. Women picked bitter herbs where no corn would grow. Fathers hunted lean game in unfamiliar woods. Children learned to chew leather for a scrap of sustenance. Each mouthful of stolen corn or meager stew was a victory against a world that seemed determined to forget them. Yet hunger wasn't the only poison that infected the new land. The psychological wounds of removal ran deeper than any frozen night. Communities that had lived together for centuries, sharing songs and ceremonies by the same rivers, burying their dead in the same sacred hills, were torn apart and scattered across a land that had no memory of them. Ceremonial grounds were left behind. Burial sites, the bones of ancestors older than the United States itself, abandoned to the plow and the fence post. Generations of stories, of songs, of names whispered to the morning sun owl adrift on foreign soil. Under the watchful gaze of federal agents, tribes were forced to adapt, their every move observed, their every word noted by men who would never understand what had been lost. And yet, somehow, they found ways to resist, not always with rifles, but with quiet, stubborn hope. The Cherokee rebuilt their government, shaping a new council that echoed the structure they had known in Georgia's Green Hills. They re-established schools where children once more learned to write the language Sequoia had given Thema, language that had survived the Trail of Tears and would not be silenced. The Choctaw wrote a constitution in their new homeland, binding themselves to one another with words stronger than any white man's decree. The Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole wove their traditions into the new earth, even as they learned to plow it. In every council meeting, in every whispered prayer over a grave dug too shallow in frozen ground, they declared, "We are still here." These acts of rebuilding were not just survival, they were defiance. They were proof that cultural genocide had not succeeded, that no forced march or broken promise could erase the deep roots of a people who had walked these lands long before the first American flag was ever sown. But the divisions that removal had sown cut deep, festering like old wounds that refused to heal. Among the Cherokee, the bitterness that began with the signing of the Treaty of New Echota lingered like a storm cloud. Major Ridge and Elias Boudinottu had signed away the lands of their people in what they believed was a desperate gamble to preserve something in the face of total destruction, were seen by many as traitors. In the years after the Trail of Tears, they were hunted down and killed by fellow Cherokee who believed they had sold out their nation's soul for a handful of coins and empty promises. These divisions weakened the unity of the tribes, turning council meetings into battlegrounds of memory and regret. Grudges whispered in the dark and carried on the wind, until no one could remember a time when everyone had trusted one another without question. And even in Indian Territory, the white man's hunger was not yet sated. The so-called permanent Indian frontier turned out to be as permanent as the promises that built it gone as soon as it was no longer convenient. White settlers and land speculators pressed at the borders of the new lands, eyes bright with the same greedy light that had driven them from Tennessee and Georgia. The railroads came next, those iron snakes cutting across tribal lands with the promise of progression, the reality of displacement. The federal government, never content with what it had taken, began to renegotiate treaties, each new piece of paper another chance to steal more land. Missionaries and merchants poured in alongside surveyors and soldiers, each one bringing the weight of the outside world down on the fragile beginnings of these new communities. Indian Territory was meant to be a solution, a final chapter, Instead, it was just another page in a story of betrayal that stretched back to the first handshake and the first broken promise. The tribes had been marched west to clear the way for America's growth, but even here, they were still in the way, still seen as obstacles, still treated as strangers in a land they had been forced to call home. The Trail of Tears did more than move people from one side of the Mississippi to the other. It changed the soul of a nation. For Native American tribes, it marked the beginning of an exile that went far beyond geography. It was an exile from the promises they had been told would protect them from the rights they had been assured as sovereign nations, from the respect they had earned through centuries of stewardship over the land. For the United States, the Trail of Tears became a symbol sometimes brandished with pride as proof of manifest destiny, sometimes buried in shameful silence. It was a reminder that the dream of expansion had always been paid for in the blood of those who stood in its path. The betrayal wasn't a single act or a single treaty. It was a system, a way of thinking that saw treaties as temporary, as obstacles to be moved aside when convenient. The Indian Removal Act, which had promised lands in perpetuity, was only the beginning. Within decades, even those fragile scraps of security were taken away again. In the late 19th century, the Dawes Act would come. It would carve tribal lands into individual allotments, turning communal land into private plots meant to break the back of tribal governance. What had been held in common for generations was now cut up and sold to white settlers, piece by piece. Even in exile, the tribes found their new homes eroded beneath them, the promises of the past as hollow as the treaties they had signed under duress. The loss wasn't just of land, it was of language, of ceremony, of stories passed from mother to daughter around the fire, oral traditions interrupted, languages threatened. Governance systems that had stood for centuries buckled under the weight of forced assimilation and constant surveillance. Children were sent to boarding schools where they were taught that their languages were curses, their dances sins, their very identity something to be scrubbed clean. Yet in every act of survival, every school rebuilt, every council convened, every whispered story told in a language the white man never learned, there was a quiet refusal to disappear. The Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole proved that removal could scatter them, but it could not erase them. They learned that the land was more than soil, it was memory, and memory, once seeded, can never be fully uprooted. For all the damage that removal and betrayal inflicted on Native American nations, one truth survived every winter night and every forced mile. Identity endures. The Trail of Tears became more than a path of sorrow. It became a rallying cry, a testament to resistance and remembrance that would shape the generations to come. In the broader American story, the Trail of Tears was long hidden behind polite half-truths and schoolbook euphemisms. For decades, textbooks treated it as a sad footnote in the march of progressive tragedy, sure, but one wrapped in the glow of manifest destiny. Teachers and historians spoke of necessary removal, of inevitable expansion, as if the land itself had demanded the Cherokee and the Creek, the Choctaw and the Chickasaw, the Seminole vanish like mist at dawn. The pain of these journeys was softened by the language of destiny, the violence of forced exile dressed up as the march of civilization. It was not until the late 20th century that the full weight of this history began to claw its way back into the public eye. Monuments rose where there had been only silence. Historical trails were mapped out, tracing the footsteps of those driven from their homelands. In 1987, the U.S. Congress designated the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail, a first formal step in recognizing that this journey of loss had shaped more than tribal landsit, had carved a wound into the soul of a nation. But no monument can bring back what was taken. No historical marker can replace the songs that died with those who never reached the end of the trail, or the futures that were cut short before they had even begun. Generations of children never born in the river valleys their ancestors once called home. Generations who would never see the mountains of their grandparents' stories. The Trail of Tears became a scar that runs through time, a place where memory clings like moss to every mile. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole were not defeated. They were betrayed. Their survival was not a gift of American mercy, was the triumph of their own resilience, the stubborn refusal to vanish even when every mile of muddy road and every broken promise told them to lay down and die. The Trail of Tears is not some ancient chapter lost to yellowed pages. Its echoes still shape the fight for land, sovereignty, education, and justice today. The betrayal of treaties never fully ended. It only shifted form. In courtroom battles and legislative chambers, tribal nations still fight to protect the scraps of land that remain, to secure the rights they were promised in solemn words that turn to dust. Yet for all the weight of these betrayals, there is a deeper truth that endures: the determination of those who survived. The ancestors who walked the Trail of Tears carried with them more than heartbreak. They carried songs, prayers, and a fierce memory that would not be silenced by the cold of winter or the boot of the soldier. Today, the Trail of Tears stands as both a historical wound and a symbol of unbreakable spirit. It is remembered not just for the cruelty that drove thousands from their homes, but for the quiet, unyielding strength of those who survived. I tanned for the descendants who keep that memory alive. Across the United States, efforts to preserve this memory have grown. In Oklahoma, in Georgia, in Alabama and Tennessee, tribal nations and allies mark the trail each year with remembrance walks, prayer gatherings, and educational events. At schools and museums, children hear the stories their grandparents once whispered around the fire stories that no white textbook ever fully told. The Trail of Tears, National Historic Trail, stretches thousands of miles, weaving through forests and over rivers that once echoed with the songs of forced marches. Interpretive centers stand where soldiers once herded families like livestock. Markers and memorials rise where wagons sank into the mud and hearts sank with them. But no stone monument, no plaque etched with names, can replace the truth that remembering is more than looking back. It's an act of survival. For Native communities, remembering is not passive. It's a declaration of identity that refuses to be erased. It's in the classes where children learn the languages their ancestors carried like embers across frozen plains. It's in the songs that rise each year to honor the names of those who fell, and the prayers that speak to the spirits of the old ones whose bones lie along the trail. It's in the gardens of heirloom seeds, in the quiet spaces where elders gather to tell the stories that still matter. The Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek have all launched programs to teach these histories, to revive languages and ceremonies nearly lost. Where once the federal government tried to silence them, they now speak with voices strengthened by memory and pride. Yet for all these acts of reclamation, the work of reckoning remains unfinished. America's broader memory has long been a landscape of convenient amnesia. For generations, the Trail of Tears was a story told in half-truths presented as the price of progress, a regrettable but necessary step on the road to a united nation. Only recently have schools and public institutions begun to grapple with the truth that it was a story of greed masked in law, of conquest draped in the language of democracy, of native peoples cast aside in their own homelands. This reckoning is not just about history. It lives in the modern fights for land and rights. It echoes in the protests to protect sacred waters, in the courtrooms where tribal sovereignty is still debated as if it were a privilege rather than a birthright. It surfaces in every conversation about environmental justice, about access to healthcare and education, about the basic human dignity that was denied to those forced westward one winter so long ago. The consequences of the Trail of Tears still ripple through every acre of native land, every family line that traces its roots to that long, hard walk. But so too does the strength that carried those nations forward mile after mile, step after step, refusal after refusal. To remember the Trail of Tears is not simply to honor the dead, it is to stand with the living. It is to demand that history not be rewritten to comfort the powerful or excuse the guilty. It is to say in every classroom and council meeting, in every sunrise that breaks over the plains of Oklahoma, we are still here. Because each act of remembrance is a step back toward holiness, a quiet rebellion against the erasure that removal was meant to achieve. In every powwow where children dance in the regalia of their ancestors, in every courthouse where tribes assert the rights written in blood and memory, the Trail of Tears is redefined not as a final chapter, but as a prologue to the story of survival. As this narrative shifts back to the ancient world, to the black basalt of the Code of Hammurabi standing in the dust of Babylon, we see that justice has always been a question of power. Around 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi's towering stele rose over the city like a declaration in stone laws, etched in cuneiform script, a testament to the ruler's promise of order and his power to decide what justice meant. These 282 laws covered every aspect of life: trade and theft, marriage and divorce, injury and inheritance. They spoke not just to fairness, but to the hierarchy of a world where rank meant everything. If a nobleman broke the bone of another nobleman, his own bone would be broken in turn, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, justice measured out in equal pain. But if that nobleman's victim was a commoner or a slave, the punishment shrank to a clear sign that even in Hammurabi's ordered world, the scales of justice weighed some lives more heavily than others. Even as the ancient world carved justice into stone, it was never simply about law. In Babylon, the chisel was the voice of the king Hammurabi's code, a towering monolith of basalt that declared, in sharp-edged cuneiform, who deserved mercy and who deserved pain. Builders whose shoddy walls collapsed on the heads of trusting families could pay with their lives. Merchants who cheated customers saw not just coin lost, but fingers or limbs as tribute to a harsh system. Family squabbles about who inherited what, who owed whom, who had shamed the household, were turned from private disputes into matters of the king's law. In this ancient city, the eye for an eye principle was not just a phrase, but a way of ordering the world, a brutal balance to keep a growing empire's pulse steady. Yet what made the Code of Hammurabi revolutionary wasn't just the blood-soaked punishments it prescribed, it was that it was public. It stood tall in the marketplaces, where the dust of the streets and the cries of traders mixed with the silent testimony of carved words. It declared that justice was not a secret. It was something all could see, though few could read. Hammurabi had himself chiseled in eternal stone, receiving the law from Shamash, the sun god who watched all. It was a spectacle of divine right, a reminder that the king's rule was as inevitable as the sunrise, and his laws as unbreakable as the sun's daily climb. In this way, the stele was both law and propaganda. It said to every citizen, every slave, every merchant bowing to the weight of trade, that Hammurabi's hand was steady because it was guided by heaven itself. However fierce the penalties, they were written down, carved in black basalt, so that no one nobleman, no field worker could claim they did not know. It was a monument to order and to the absolute authority of the state. Compared to Babylon's cold chisel, ancient Egypt's concept of justice flowed like the Nile itself, less a code of punishments than a cosmic principle. In the land of the pharaohs, justice was not just a set of rules, it was Mat, a divine presence that wove truth, balance, and harmony into the very fabric of the universe. Pharaohs did not rule as mere kings. They were guardians of Mat, charged with keeping the world in balance. In upholding Mat, they kept the Nile's floods predictable, the seasons turning in order, the spirits of the dead at rest. Egypt's justice was not written on any single monument to endure the centuries. No single tablet, no single stele spelled out the punishments for theft or adultery. Instead, judges, often priests or high officials, interpreted Mat for each case, weighing not just the facts but the moral weight of each soul who stood before them. It was a system that could show mercy because it could see nuance, but it could also bend with the wind of social status. In a land where pharaohs walked as living gods, a poor man's plea did not always weigh the same as a noble's complaint. Court proceedings in Egypt were both ritual and record. Papyrus scrolls documented everything, contracts inked in neat lines, testimonies carried on woven fibers that could outlast generations. Witnesses were crucial. Disputes were tried in village councils or royal courts, the severity of the case dictating the grandeur of the setting. For minor thefts, a fine or a public beating might suffice shame as much a punishment as pain. But for the great taboos tom robbery, blasphemeth there was no forgiveness. The tombs of pharaohs were not just resting places. They were sealed worlds where the divine met the earth. To violate them was to spit in the face of every god Egypt had ever known. Punishments for such crimes were as final as the grave. Execution by fire, by drowning, or by impalement methods that declared not just the end of a life, but a warning to every soul who dared to break the fragile order of the world. Even in death, justice reached out. Tomb robbers might find their bodies denied burial, left to rot in the sun denied the afterlife, the greatest punishment an Egyptian could imagine. Perhaps the most evocative image of Egyptian justice lies not in any courtroom but in the Book of the Dead. Here, the soul of the departed stands before Osiris, and the heart-heavy with secrets faces the feather of Maat. If the scales tipped even slightly out of balance, the soul was fed to the monstrous Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippoa, devourer of eternity. In this vision, justice was not only about what was done in life, it was about the soul's harmony with the universe. Where Egypt saw justice as a dance between the soul and the cosmos, the ancient Greeks turned it into a forum of argument and debate. In the bustling city of Athens during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, the Greeks built a system that would echo down through millennia. Here, justice was not the edict of a king or the whim of a priesthood, was the chorus of 1,000 voices, each man a part of the city's destiny. In Athens, justice meant participation. Every male citizen, no matter how poor, had the right to stand in the courts, to bring suit or defend himself, and to serve as a juror in trials that could decide life and death. There were no professional judges to smooth out the passions of the day. Instead, massive juries, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, were drawn by lot, the randomness a shield against corruption. They listened to cases that were as much performance as proof, measured not by precedent, but by persuasion. Trials were fast, often decided in a single day, the speeches of plaintiff and defendant measured by a water clock, the clepsydra, whose gentle drip was the heartbeat of Athenian democracy. There was no second chance, no appeal. When the jurors cast their pebbles, the decision was final. The range of crimes tried in Athens was as broad as the city's teeming streets: theft, slander, adultery, assault. Even the impiety of disrespecting the gods could draw the city's wrath. Socrates himself, whose words had stirred so many minds, found his fate decided in such a court. Convicted not by law but by the fears and prejudices of his fellow citizens, he drank hemlock and joined the long line of those for whom Athenian justice was as much a mirror of the city's anxieties as it was a measure of guilt. There were no grand codes of law in Athens, no stone monument to rival Hammurabi's stele. Some laws were inscribed in public places, but the real power lay in the spoken word, in the lips of those who could weave a clever argument. In this world, a wealthy man could hire the best orators, masters of language, who could turn a jury's heart with a single phrase. Justice became a theater, and those who spoke well could turn even a lie into freedom. Athenians even had a way to wield justice: preemptive liostracism. Once a year, citizens could scratch a name onto a shard of pottery, voting to banish a man not for any crime, but because they feared his power, his ambition, his ability to disrupt the delicate balance of their city. 10 years of exile was the price of too much success or too much suspiciona, reminder that in Athens, as in every human society, justice was always tangled with fear. The state, though imperfect, found its truest expression in ancient Greece in the idea that justice was not solely the voice of a king or the judgment of a priesthood, was the heartbeat of the community itself. Athens, loud and chaotic, showed the world that justice could be a civic responsibility, shared by those who rose each day to work the land or craft the words that shaped the city's soul. It was a promise, however fragile, that the law belonged to the people. This experiment in civic law was messy, prone to corruption and manipulation by skilled orators, but it planted seeds that would bloom centuries later in the idea of trial by peers, of a courtroom that belonged to the people as much as to the magistrate. In every echo of the jury's voice today, there is a whisper of the noisy Athenian courtroom where men argued not just for themselves, but for what their city could be. Yet beyond the shores of Greece and the stone halls of Babylon, justice in ancient India flowed from a deeper, more spiritual wellspring. Here, the very word for justice, dharma, was not merely a list of crimes and punishments. It was a principle that connected the individual to the cosmos. Dharma was duty and righteousness, a way of living in harmony with the world and the gods who watched over it. It was a standard that measured not only what you did, but why you did, intent, balance, and the endless cycle of cause and effect. In India, justice was not one size fits all. It was tailored to the soul and to the station of the one who stood accused. Your caste, your age, your gender, these were all threads in the tapestry of Dharma, each shaping what was expected of you and how your missteps would be weighed. The Dharma Shastras, those ancient texts of social and spiritual law, set the framework for centuries. Chief among them, the Manusmriti compiled somewhere between the 2nd century BCE and the 3rd century CE, offered a vision of justice that was as rigid in hierarchy as it was fluid in moral purpose. These texts were not laws in the way the Hammurabi Code or Roman 12 tables would be understood. They were guides, spiritual roadmaps that taught kings and subjects alike how to live within the order of the universe. They spoke of property and inheritance, of how to manage a marriage and how to punish a thief. But more than that, they spoke of how to live with honor, how to keep your soul in balance even when the world around you tilted. Justice here was tied to the caste system, an ordering of society that gave privilege to the Brahmins, the priests, and keepers of knowledge, while placing the Sudras, laborers, at the foot of the social ladder. A Brahmin who stole might pay a fine, his spiritual authority still seen as too precious to taint with physical punishment. But a Sudra, for the same crime, might feel the bite of a whip or the sting of shame in exile. Justice was never blind in ancient Indiaite, had eyes wide open to the hierarchies of birth. Yet for all its harshness, this system also had room for mercy. Intent mattered. Repentance was possible. A soul that strayed could find its way back through penance, through acts of charity that rebuilt the bridges it had burned. Kings, seen as the final arbiters of justice, were guided by Brahmin scholars and wise ministers who reminded them that their power was a gift, bound by the greater law of Dharma. When cases were tangled in doubt, when no witness could be trusted, when no confession could be coaxed, ancient India, like many other cultures, turned to the gods themselves. The ordeal, a ritual of trial by fire and water, became a last resort, a way to let the divine speak where human voices had failed. A man might walk across burning plowshares or plunge his hand into boiling oil to retrieve a coin, his survival seen as proof of innocence. The gods, it was believed, would not let the pure suffer needlessly. This was no cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a faith that justice was bigger than the frail human courts, that the same cosmic order that spun the stars also weighed the hearts of men. The trial by ordeal was a testament to how deeply these ancient peoples felt the need for something beyond mortal judgment, a final authority that was both terrifying and reassuring. In Babylon, this took the form of the river ordeal. The accused would be cast into the water if he floated or survived. The gods had judged him blameless. If he sank, well, the river kept its secrets. In a world where evidence could be twisted by silver tongues and false witnesses, the river was seen as incorruptible lights, currents, the voice of the divine. The ordeal was never the first step. It was a door swung open only when every other path had been blocked, but its power lay not just in the physical trial, but in the mind of the accused. To stand before the gods and swear your innocence was to place your soul on the scales of eternity. Even the threat of such a test could break a liar's resolve or give courage to the wrongly accused. These trials by fire, by water, by oath remind us how fragile human systems of justice could be. and how desperate people were to believe in something that could see beyond the petty games of politics and wealth. In every ritual, in every burnt palm or waterlogged corpse, there was a plea. Let the truth be known. Let the innocent walk free. Let the guilty face the judgment of something greater than man. Yet for all their solemn grandeur, these ancient legal systems were as flawed as the societies they served. In Babylon, the stele of Hammurabi cast a long shadow, but it also etched inequality into the very stone of the city. In Egypt, Ma'at wove balance into the world, but the poor still knelt lower before the throne of the pharaoh. In Greece, the chorus of democracy could be drowned out by the silver tongue of a cunning speaker. In India, Dharma's vision of cosmic order was tangled in the roots of caste, a hierarchy that weighed a man's soul by the accident of his birth. What these systems shared was a belief that justice was not merely the will of the powerful, it was the lifeblood of the community, the thread that held the world together. They knew that without justice, no king's crown could stay on his head for long, no temple's altar could stay clean, and so they wrote it into stone, sang it in hymns, wove it into the daily rituals of life. Even when they turned to supernatural signs to find the truth, ancient peoples revealed something universal, a desperate desire for fairness. These trials by ordeal, terrifying and brutal though they were, had an odd sort of equality in them. Kings and commoners alike might be forced to walk across red-hot plowshares or plunge their hands into boiling oil to let the gods decide their innocence. In the absence of forensics or legal systems as we know them, pain itself became a kind of courtroom. The gods, impartial and all-seeing, were expected to serve as judge, jury, and executioner. In ancient Egypt, the ideal of justice was different from that of Babylon or Greece. Here, justice was not meted out by elected juries or even impartial judges. It was an extension of the pharaoh himself. The pharaoh, seen as both king and living god, was the earthly vessel of Ma'at, the divine principle of truth, balance, and cosmic harmony. For the Egyptians, upholding Ma'at was not merely a matter of civil order, it was the very glue that held the universe together. Because of this, the pharaoh was more than a ruler. He was the source of all legal authority. His word could override any verdict, command the execution of criminals, pardon the guilty, or rewrite the rules entirely. This absolute power was justified, not through logic or popular will, but by divine mandate. To challenge the pharaoh was to defy the balance of the cosmos itself. Yet even this seemingly all-powerful ruler did not govern alone. A vast bureaucracy extended from the throne in the capital to the smallest villages along the Nile. Royal officials, scribes, and local magistrates carried out the king's will, each acting as judge, investigator, and mediator in turn. Theirs was a justice guided not by a single, comprehensive code, but by the principles of Ma'at and the precedents set by those who came before them. Written laws, as we understand them today, were rare in Egypt. Cases were decided based on custom, precedent, and the wisdom of trained scribes who knew how to interpret Ma'at's demands in daily life. In local communities, disputes over land, marriage, or theft might be settled by councils of elders or by priests who served as the voice of the divine in matters of justice. In the larger cities, formal judgment halls echoed with the clamor of more complex case property disputes, inheritance battles, or accusations of sacrilege that reached deep into the spiritual life of the people. The proceedings of these courts were meticulously recorded on papyrus scrolls records that have survived the centuries to give us glimpses into how the Egyptians argued, pleaded, and decided. Plaintiffs and defendants would come forward, each recounting their version of events, often under oath. Witnesses were summoned to swear to what they had seen, and when available, physical evidence was weighed with care. False accusations were treated as serious offenses, and if proven, the accuser might find themselves suffering the very punishment they had tried to bring down on another's head. The range of punishments varied widely. Restitution and fines were common for lesser infractions away to restore balance and compensate for loss. But more serious crimes could lead to flogging, forced labor in the fields or quarries, or even execution. Crimes against temples, tombs, or the property of the pharaoh carried special weight. To steal from the dead or the gods was to risk your soul in this life and the next. Yet Egyptian justice was not simply a tool of punishment. It also held space for rehabilitation. In many cases, a wrongdoer who confessed and repented could find a path back to favor, offered the chance to make amends through acts of restitution or public contrition. This balance between severity and mercy, between retribution and moral correction, was at the heart of Ma'at. A pharaoh who ruled with fairness was not merely obeyed. He was honored as the protector of cosmic balance, the keeper of order in a world always threatening to slip back into chaos. While Egypt's justice flowed from the divine, ancient Greece, particularly democratic Athens, took a radically different approach. Here, justice became something shared, a civic duty enacted by the people themselves. No single figure held all the power. Instead, it was the community, the citizens of Athens who were both judges and lawgivers, shaping justice with every debate and every vote. Two institutions formed the backbone of this system. First was the ecclesia, the assembly of citizens who met on the hill of the Pnyx to make decisions for the city. In theory, any free male citizen could stand and speak, proposing new laws or repealing old ones. It was here that justice was woven into the very fabric of Athenian life, because the law was not something distant or imposed, but something the citizens themselves could shape. The second pillar was the Heliaea, a massive popular court that gave every citizen the right to seek redress for wrongs. Here, justice was no secret ritual. It was a public act, performed in open courts where hundreds of jurors chosen by lot to guard against bribery or bias listened to the cases of their neighbors. These jurors were the final word. No appeals, no higher authority. Their verdicts were swift, and their decisions were absolute. The trials themselves were theatrical and passionate. There were no professional judges or lawyers to smooth out the rough edges. Each side plaintiff and defendant had a set time to speak, measured by the slow, steady drip of a water clock called a clepsydra. Rhetoric was everything. A skilled speaker could sway the hearts of the jury more easily than a mountain of evidence. In a world where few could read and even fewer could write, the spoken word had a power that no scroll could match. The cases ranged from theft and property disputes to slander, assault, and even impiety. Disrespect toward the gods was a crime that could carry the ultimate penalty. Socrates himself, who had spent a lifetime challenging the city's assumptions, was condemned to death in just such a trial, his quiet arguments no match for the fears of the majority. Yet this system, for all its noise and imperfection, held a seed of something new, the idea that justice could be democratic, that it was not the preserve of kings or priests, but the shared responsibility of all who called the city home. It was not without its failings. The rich could still sway the jury with hired orators. Popular prejudice could drown out the quiet truth of a poor man's case, but it was a vision of justice that recognized the people themselves as its heart and soul. In the end, whether under the pharaoh's divine mandate or the roar of an Athenian assembly, justice in the ancient world was always more than a list of punishments. It was a mirror of each society's deepest beliefs about power, about order, about what it meant to be human in a world where the gods watched and the earth remembered. In ancient Athens, justice was not a quiet decree passed down from a king's throne or a divine priest's sanctuary. Instead, it roared in the voices of everyday citizens gathered under the sun, debating the fate of their peers. Unlike in Egypt or Babylon, where the ruler's word was law, Athens turned justice into a civic dance, choreographed by the people themselves. Here, the law was shaped in the assembly, where any male citizen could stand and propose new rules or challenge old ones. In this bustling forum, laws were not static commands etched in stone, but living ideas that grew and changed as the citizens saw fit. It was a system that lived and breathed, though not without its flaws. Trials in Athens took place before massive juries, sometimes numbering 500 men or more, drawn by lot from citizens over the age of 30. This random selection was meant to guard against corruption, and ensure that justice was a shared civic duty, not the province of the rich or the powerful. There were no professional judges in the modern sense. Instead, magistrates, chosen by lottery or popular vote, acted as facilitators organizing trials, overseeing the proceedings, and ensuring that everyone played by the rules. But the real power belonged to the jurors. These citizen judges decided the verdict, and their decision was final. There were no appeals, no higher court to correct a miscarriage of justice. In fact, there wasn't even a deliberation room. Jurors listened to the arguments, voted in secret, and that was that verdicts and penalties were determined swiftly, with no turning back. This system favored persuasion over evidence. Plaintiffs and defendants had to speak for themselves or hire skilled orators to craft their words of practice that turned the courtroom into a kind of theater. Rhetoric was everything. A stirring speech could tip the scales, while a stumble in delivery might doom even a righteous cause. It was a system that asked every citizen to be both actor and audience, judge and judged. The potential for manipulation was real. A man who could speak well, or who could afford to pay someone else to speak for him, held a distinct advantage. Justice could become a performance, swayed less by facts and more by the passions of the moment. Yet for all its messiness, this system also introduced radical ideas. The importance of peer judgment, the right of every citizen to have a say in the fate of their community, and the principle that the law was not a distant power but something that lived in the voices of the people themselves. One of the most striking tools of Athenian democracy was ostracism. Once a year, citizens gathered to decide if anyone had grown too powerful, too dangerous to the fragile balance of the city. No crime needed to be proven just the suspicion that someone threatened the health of democracy. The citizens would scratch names onto shards of pottery, and if a man's name appeared too often, he was exiled for 10 years. No trial, no defense. Just the collective decision that his absence would restore harmony. Despite its imperfections, its bias towards skilled speakers, its vulnerability to popular emotion, Athenian justice was a revolution. It showed that the law did not have to be the tool of the few. It could be the voice of the many, a living testament to the power of community. In Greece, the courtroom was not just a place of judgment, it was a stage where the people themselves wrote the script. In ancient India, justice was a different kind of story, woven not just into the law, but into the very soul of the universe. Here, it was bound up in the idea of karma, the belief that every action, no matter how small, had moral and spiritual consequences. This was not merely a system of punishment and reward handed down by kings or priests. It was a cosmic ledger that balanced every thought, word, and deed. Karma taught that no wrongdoing escaped the gaze of the universe. A thief might evade the judgment of human courts, but his actions would ripple out into the cosmos, bringing suffering back to him in ways he might never see coming. A kind deed, on the other hand, would plant seeds of blessing, perhaps in this life, perhaps in the next. It was a system that transcended the walls of any courtroom, an invisible force that held the world in moral balance. This spiritual dimension did not replace human law. Ancient India had structured legal systems, formalized in texts like the Manusmriti and the other Dharma Shastras. These texts were more than law codes, they were moral compasses, offering guidance not only for the courtroom, but for every aspect of life. They told kings how to rule, merchants how to trade, and families how to honor their duties to one another. Justice in India was not one size fits all. It was shaped by dharma, which changed depending on who you were. A Brahmin priest, a Kshatriya warrior, a Vaishya merchant, a Shudra labor reach had different responsibilities and different expectations under the law. This caste-based structure meant that punishment, too, was not uniform. A Brahmin who broke the law might face a fine or a ritual exclusion. A Shudra, for the same crime, could face corporal punishment or worse. The law was not blind here, it saw clearly the social order, and it weighed each person according to their place in it. Yet even within this hierarchy, Indian justice had room for the heart. Intent mattered. If a crime was committed in ignorance, or if the wrongdoer showed sincere repentance, the punishment could be lessened. Penance, acts of charity, or spiritual cleansing could restore a soul to balance, reflecting a belief that justice was not merely about retribution, but about restoring harmony. Kings, as the highest judges in the land, were expected to rule according to Dharma. Their failure to do so was more than a political mistake. It was a spiritual failing that could bring disorder to the entire kingdom. The king's authority was balanced by the council of Brahmin advisors, who reminded him that his power was not absolute. It was a trust, a sacred duty to uphold the moral order of the world. In the 5th century BCE, as Buddhism spread across India, this spiritual view of justice found new expression. Buddhism rejected the caste-based inequalities of the Dharma Shastras, teaching instead a universal moral law, that every being had the same right to compassion, the same duty to truthfulness and nonviolence. While Buddhism did not create a formal legal code, its teachings reshaped how many Indians thought about justice, emphasizing not hierarchy but the shared human duty to live in harmony with all life. When the Buddhist emperor Ashoka came to power in the 3rd century BCE, the drumbeats of conquest that had once echoed across the Indian subcontinent suddenly fell silent. Ashoka, who had inherited an empire carved by war, turned away from bloodshed and set his sights on a different kind of conquest, the conquest of the self. Inspired by Buddhist ethics, he abandoned military expansion and began to craft a kingdom grounded in compassion and moral accountability. His rock edicts, etched into stone cliffs and pillars across India, became a new kind of law code. They didn't list crimes and punishments in the style of Hammurabi or the Dharma Shastras. Instead, they called for kindness, for the fair treatment of all beings, humans and animals alike, and for a ruler to see himself as a shepherd rather than a tyrant. Justice, for Ashoka, wasn't just about courtroom verdicts or public decrees. It was about the intention behind every action, the moral weight of every decision. This shift in perspective was profound. A person might evade the penalty of an earthly court, but they could not outrun the consequences of karma. Justice became deeply personal, as much a matter of the soul as of the state. Kings who governed without compassion, who ruled through greed or violence, were believed to be sowing seeds of suffering for themselves in future lives. The universe, it was said, kept a perfect account of every deed, even those that never reached the ears of a judge. This karmic view of justice was powerful because it made every individual their own final judge. No matter how powerful a ruler might be, no matter how clever a thief, they could not bribe or sweet-talk the laws of the cosmos. This was a justice system that reached beyond the walls of palaces and courts. It lived in every breath, every intention, a force of restoration that flowed through the world. Centuries have passed since Ashoka's empire flourished, but the echoes of his ideas still resonate. They remind us that justice is not merely a matter of punishment or reward, but of healing, of restoring the harmony that binds society to the self, and both to the vast unseen threads of the universe. And so, as we look back across the millennia to the civilizations of Babylon, Egypt, Greece, and India, we see not just ancient systems of control, but the foundations of our own legal and moral philosophies. Babylon gave us the idea that the law must be public, written down for all to see, visible justice to check the secret whims of kings. Hammurabi's eye for an eye remains a potent symbol today, debated in courtrooms and classrooms alike. Is it a call for fairness, or a warning of how easily justice can become vengeance? Egypt taught us that justice can be more than a social contract. It can be a cosmic one. The pharaoh, seen as the living embodiment of Maat, had to keep the balance not just in the courtroom but in the heart of the nation. The idea that a just ruler is one who serves not only his people but the moral order itself still shapes how we see leadership today. In every modern effort at restorative justice, in every attempt to heal rather than just punish, we can hear the whisper of Maat's feather, weighing hearts against truth. Greece, with its bustling assemblies and citizen juries, dared to believe that justice belonged to the people. There were no divine kings handing down sentences from gilded thrones. Instead, there was a noisy, messy democracy, where justice was not the privilege of the few but the responsibility of the many. The Athenian system was flawed. It excluded women, foreigners, and slaves, but it also introduced the idea that every citizen's voice matters in the courtroom. That idea lives on in our jury trials, in the debates of parliaments and congresses, in the belief that law is not something imposed, but something shaped by the people themselves. India added a spiritual dimension to this tapestry, weaving law and morality together in the idea of dharma. Justice was not merely about following rules, it was about living in accordance with a higher order, a cosmic harmony that transcended kings and courts. Even today, the Indian legal system reflects this dual heritage. British common law layered atop ancient traditions of moral and religious law, a reminder that no matter how modern our systems become, they are built on the bones of the past. Of course, none of these ancient systems was perfect. They were often deeply unjust, privileging the rich and powerful, punishing the vulnerable and the poor. They enshrined hierarchies of class, caste, and gender, and too often used law to reinforce those divisions. But even as they failed, they asked the questions that still haunt us today. Who decides what justice is? Is it written in the will of the gods, in the votes of citizens, in the quiet conscience of each individual? Should it be the same for everyone, or should it bend to the needs of the moment? We are heirs to these questions. Our modern laws may be more humane, more structured, more evenly applied, but they carry the DNA of these ancient codes. We still carve our laws into stone figuratively, if not literally, believing they can hold back the chaos of the world. We still gather in courts and assemblies, hoping that the noise of debate can produce something like truth. We still ask, can power and fairness truly coexist, or will one always devour the other? In this sense, our search for justice is as ancient as the first farmer who asked for his stolen grain to be returned. It is a search that began in the flickering lamplight of Babylonian temples, in the hushed halls of Egyptian palaces, in the dusty plazas of Athens, and the forested hermitages of ancient India. And it continues, wherever people gather to decide what is fair, what is right, what is worth fighting for. We might never find a perfect answer. No law can capture every nuance of the human heart. No code can heal every wound. But in the striving itself, in the refusal to let might alone decide what is right, we keep faith with the past and write our own chapter in this long, unfinished story.